The door hit Elena Mercer in the face before she could even finish knocking. Not an accident. Harold Greer swung it open just far enough to look at her. Really look at her, the way a man examines something he's already decided to throw out. And then he shoved it shut so hard the wooden frame cracked against her cheek. Lila screamed. The little girl had been sleeping against her mother's shoulder, 2 years old and already too familiar with the cold, and the bang startled her into a wail that cut straight through the Wyoming wind. "I said get off my land," Greer bellowed from behind the door. "Third time this week somebody's come begging at my gate. You people think I'm running a poorhouse?" Elena stood there on his porch, with her cheeks stinging and her daughter crying and the temperature dropping toward nothing. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She just turned around, picked up the suitcase with her free hand, and walked back into the dark. That was the 7th door in 3 days. If you've ever been so tired that shame stops working, so exhausted that your pride just quietly sets itself down in the road and doesn't get back up, then you already know where Elena Mercer was standing that night. And if you've never been there, pray you never are. Before we go any further, if this kind of story speaks to you, if you believe one act of kindness can change a life, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell so you never miss what's coming next. And while you're watching, drop a comment below and tell me the city or country you're watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to me. Now stay with Elena. She's not done yet. The cold in Wyoming in late October doesn't creep up on you. It arrives like a verdict. Elena had grown up in Missouri, where winters were something you complained about over coffee, and then went back inside to forget. She had not understood, when she followed Thomas Mercer out here 18 months ago, that the wind off the Laramie Range had no interest in mercy. Thomas had understood it. He'd been born here, raised here, buried here. And that last part was the part that mattered now, because he'd been in the ground for 4 months, and Elena was still breathing, and she had Lila to think about, and the $37 left in her coat pocket wasn't going to change that math, no matter how many ways she tried to rearrange it. She walked back down Harold Greer's dirt road without looking back. Lila had stopped screaming and gone into that particular silence that was somehow worse. The tight-faced, sniffling quiet of a child who has learned that crying doesn't always bring anyone. "It's okay," Elena said, though she had no idea if that was true. Lila pressed her face into her mother's neck and said nothing. The suitcase weighed 40 pounds if it weighed an ounce. Elena had packed it herself the night after Thomas's funeral, when Margaret Holm, Thomas's aunt, the woman who owned the house they'd been renting, had sat across the kitchen table and explained, not unkindly but not kindly either, that she needed the property back. She had a nephew coming from Casper. She was sorry about Thomas, truly, but the rent had been 2 months behind before he even got sick, and there was simply nothing she could do. Elena had nodded. She had thanked the woman. She'd packed. She had put in everything she thought she might need and then removed half of it because she couldn't carry half of it, and then stood in the empty bedroom looking at the piles she'd left behind and felt something go quiet inside her. Not peaceful, just quiet, like a clock that stopped. That had been the beginning of this. The road from Greer's property fed out onto a wider dirt track that passed for a county road out here. No street lights, no houses for another 3 miles in either direction. The sky was doing what Wyoming skies did, putting on an enormous, indifferent show of stars while the temperature moved steadily toward the teens. Elena stopped walking and tried to think. She had tried the town of Dunmore first, 2 nights ago. She'd gone to the boarding house on Main Street, the one with the blue shutters that Thomas had pointed out once, saying it was decent enough. The woman who answered the door had looked at Elena and then at Lila and then at the suitcase and said the rooms were full. Elena had asked if she knew anywhere else. The woman had said she didn't and closed the door. She'd tried the church, not for the faith of it, just because churches sometimes had people who helped. The young minister there had been genuinely sorry, she thought. But the congregation was small and there was no fund for this sort of thing, and he'd given her the names of 2 ranches outside town where they might take on help. He'd said might the way people say it when they mean probably not. The first ranch, the Dalton place, had a hand answer the door who told her Mr. Dalton wasn't hiring and hadn't been for 2 years. The second, a sheep operation run by a woman named Burgess, had seemed more promising right up until Mrs. Burgess asked whether Elena had references from her previous employer, and Elena had to explain that she didn't have a previous employer. Exactly. She'd been keeping house for her and her husband, and Mrs. Burgess's expression had shifted in a way that closed the conversation. Then the nights. 2 of them now. The first she'd spent in the livery stable at the edge of Dunmore, where the hostler had let her sleep in an empty stall for what she suspected was pity. More than anything, and the second, last night, behind the feed store, wrapped in the quilt she'd packed, Lila curled against her, both of them breathing into the cold until morning came. And then today. 7 more doors, Harold Greer being the last of them. Elena set the suitcase down on the road and shifted Lila to her other hip. Her left arm had gone numb half an hour ago, and she'd been too stubborn to put the child down. "Hungry?" she asked. "Mm-hmm," Lila said into her neck. Elena had 2 biscuits left in the cloth bag tucked inside the suitcase. She'd been rationing them since yesterday morning. She got one out now and handed it to Lila, who took it without enthusiasm. Even Lila, at 2 years old, had apparently figured out that a cold, dry biscuit in the dark wasn't something to get excited about. Elena looked up the road and then down it. Both directions looked the same, dark, flat, indifferent. She knew, in the logical part of her mind, that she needed to make a decision. She couldn't stand in the middle of a Wyoming road all night with a 2-year-old and a suitcase. She could go back into Dunmore, which was about 2 miles east, and try to find somewhere to get out of the cold. She could keep going west, which was where Greer's neighbor, someone had mentioned a Boone, she thought, though she'd never placed the name on a map, supposedly had a spread. She stood there long enough that Lila finished the biscuit and said, "More?" "Not right now, baby." "More, Mama." "I know." Elena picked up the suitcase. "I know you want more." She went west. She didn't have a good reason. She just did. The thing about desperation that people who've never been there don't quite understand is that it doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't feel like a movie. It feels tedious. It feels like your feet hurting and your arm aching and the particular mental loop of running the same arithmetic over and over. $37, 2 biscuits, 1 child, no roof, and getting the same answer every time. Elena had been a practical person before Thomas died. She'd been a practical person after too, in the first weeks, because grief had too much competition from logistics. The funeral, the finances, Margaret's kitchen table, the packing. She'd had one bad night, about 6 weeks in, when Lila had gone to sleep and Elena had sat down on the floor of a rented room in Casper and just stopped. For about an hour, she just sat there on the floor and breathed and let the weight of it sit on her chest. And then Lila had woken up wanting water, and Elena had gotten up and gotten the water, and that had been more or less the end of the bad night. Not because she felt better, just because there was water to get. She kept moving now because Lila was cold, which meant there was something to do, which was keep moving. The road bent slightly northward, and then she saw it. A light. Not town light, just a single yellow glow through what looked like a window. A structure, close enough to the road that she could make out the shape of it. Modest, low. A ranch house built by someone who wasn't trying to impress anyone. She almost didn't go to the gate. She stood at the wooden post that marked the entrance to the property and looked at that light and thought about Greer's door against her cheek. She thought about the 7 doors before that. She thought about the particular expression people's faces made when they saw her. The calculation happening behind their eyes. The rapid inventory of what she represented and what she would cost and what they could reasonably say to make her go away. Lila said, "Cold, Mama." "I know." Cold. Elena picked up the suitcase and went through the gate. Ot. The porch steps creaked under her boots. She could hear something inside, movement, the low sound of a wood stove working. She knocked 3 times and then stood back and waited and told herself it wouldn't matter either way. Another door, another decision. She was just collecting information. The door opened. The man who stood there was not old, but wasn't young either. Somewhere in that middle range that hard work makes difficult to date precisely. He was tall enough that he'd had to learn to stand straight without looking like he was trying to. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that had been out in the weather long enough to stop regurgitating it. He was in his shirt sleeves despite the cold, like he'd been inside long enough to forget what it was doing out. He looked at Elena. He looked at Lila. He looked at the suitcase. Elena waited for the calculation she'd learned to recognize. It didn't come. He just looked, and something in his face was doing nothing she could read. Not pity, not suspicion, not the particular blankness of a man preparing a polite refusal. Just looking. "Silas Boone?" she said. That's right. I'm Elena Mercer, Thomas Mercer's wife, widow. She'd been practicing saying that second word, and it still came out like she'd tripped over it. I've been trying to find work. I'm a hard worker. I can cook and clean and keep a house, and I can learn livestock if someone's willing to show me. I have a daughter. She didn't gesture toward Lila because that felt like using her as argument, and Elena wasn't willing to do that. I know it's late. I know this is... She stopped, restarted. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance to work. Silas Boone looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked past her at the dark road she'd come in from. How long have you been walking? He said. It wasn't the question she'd expected. A while. Tonight or today? Both, more or less. He was quiet for a second. Elena braced. Thomas Mercer, he said. He was ranching over near the Gillette Creek area? That's right. I heard he passed. He said it plainly. Not performing sympathy, not avoiding it, just acknowledging the fact like a man who thought facts deserved acknowledgement. I didn't know him well, saw him at a couple of auctions. He was a good man, Elena said, because it was true, and because she was tired and she wasn't in the mood to summarize Thomas for a stranger at this hour. I believe it. Silas stepped back from the door and held it open. Come in out of the cold. Elena didn't move immediately. Mr. Boone, you can argue with me tomorrow, he said. Tonight you come in. The inside of the house was plain and functional and warm. That last word, warm, hit Elena somewhere between her ribs like a physical thing. The wood stove in the corner was loaded and working, and the air in the room was the kind of warmth you'd stopped believing in. Lila, for the first time in 2 days, lifted her head off her mother's shoulder and looked around. Sit down, Silas said. It wasn't unkind, it was just direct. Like a man who'd learned that directness moved things forward when indirectness just made everybody tired. Elena sat in the nearest chair because her legs were done arguing about it. Have you eaten? He said. She almost lied. The impulse was there, to say yes, they were fine, they didn't need anything, just a place to sit for a moment, and then she'd sort something out. The lie got to her throat and just stopped there. No, she said. Not much today. He didn't say anything about that. He went to the kitchen. One room, really. The house was small, and the kitchen was the back of it, and she heard him moving pots around. Lila had gone very still, watching the fire through the stove grate with the absolute focus that only toddlers and dogs can sustain. What's her name? Silas called from the kitchen. Lila. How old? 2, just turned. A pause. You want me to heat some milk for her? I've got milk. Elena's throat did something complicated. That would be... She stopped. Yes, please, thank you. She sat there in the warm room while a man she didn't know heated milk for her daughter, and she did not cry because she had made a rule about that, and she kept her rules, but it was close. It was close in the way that kindness often is. Not the huge gestures, but the specific small ones, the milk heated for a child in the middle of the night, that find the crack in whatever armor you've managed to build. Silas came back with the bowl of something, beans with salt pork, hot, from what smelled like a pot he'd had going for himself, and a tin mug of warm milk, and set them on the table. He put a chair next to Elena's and gestured at it in a way that communicated, without stating it, that Lila could sit. Elena lifted Lila into the chair. Lila wrapped both hands around the warm tin mug and looked at it with an expression of pure seriousness. It's milk, Elena told her. Drink it slowly. Lila did not drink it slowly. She drank it the way a 2-year-old drinks something warm when she's been cold for 2 days, which is to say, all at once. And then she looked at Elena with her eyes asking a question about more. Silas was already at the kitchen reaching for the pot. Elena watched him pour more milk and thought, I don't know this man. I don't know if he's safe. I don't know what he'll want for this. And underneath that, quieter and more honest, I don't have anywhere else to go, and Lila needs milk, and this is where we are. She'd made peace with worse decisions. Well, they ate, the 3 of them, without a great deal of conversation. Silas ate his own bowl standing at the kitchen counter, which Elena suspected was so that she and Lila could have the table. Lila ate with the mechanical focus of a child who'd been hungry long enough to stop being picky, and she cleaned the bowl, which meant Elena managed to eat most of her own without guilt. When Lila was done, she leaned sideways in the chair and put her head on Elena's arm, which was her announcement that she was ready to stop existing for the next several hours. She needs to sleep, Elena said. Silas set his bowl down. He walked past them and opened a door at the back of the room that Elena hadn't noticed. Beyond it was a small room. More of a storage room, she thought, but there was a cot in it and a wool blanket. It's not much, he said. It has a roof, Elena said. It does. She carried Lila in and laid her on the cot and tucked the blanket around her, and Lila was asleep before Elena stood back up. She stood there in the small room for a moment, looking at her daughter in the first real warmth they'd had in 2 days, and let herself have about 4 seconds of something that might have been relief if she'd been willing to call it that. Then she went back out. Silas was at the table with a cup of coffee. He gestured at the pot, and Elena poured herself a cup and sat down across from him. I need to be honest with you, Elena said. All right, I have $37. I have 1 change of clothes for myself and 2 for Lila. I have no references because the only work I've done is keep a house, and the person I kept it for died. She said it flat, the way you learn to say facts that hurt. Just get them out before they can gather any weight. I knocked on 8 doors today. You're the 9th. I have nowhere to go if you say no. She paused. I'm not telling you that to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I'd rather you know the situation than make assumptions about it. Silas wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. Thomas Mercer was sick a long time? 4 months. That's a hard 4 months. It was. And before that? We were fine. She meant it. They'd been modest and they'd been working, and Thomas had had plans. He always had plans. And then the cough had started and the plans had stopped mattering. We weren't wealthy, but we were fine. Silas nodded slowly, like someone filing information rather than performing understanding. I'm not looking for charity, Elena said again. I heard you the first time. She looked at him. Then what are you thinking? He was quiet for a moment. Not in a stalling way. More like a man who'd gotten out of the habit of talking and had to locate the right words by feel. I'm thinking, he said, that this ranch is behind. I've been running it alone for going on 3 years now, and it's behind in every way a ranch can be behind without actually falling down. He looked at the window, though there was nothing to see out there but dark. I'm thinking I can't pay much, but I can pay. And there's the room, and there's food. He looked back at her. That's what I'm thinking. Elena studied his face. She was good at reading faces. She'd had to get good at it fast in the last 4 months, learning which expressions meant real help and which meant comfortable pity and which meant something else entirely. His face wasn't doing any of those things. It was doing something simpler and less comfortable, which was just telling her the truth. What would the work be, she said. What can you do? I told you, cook, clean, keep a house. She paused. I've never worked livestock, but I'm not afraid of them. I'm not afraid of hard work. I'm not... She stopped. She'd been about to say I'm not fragile, but she was tired and her cheek still ached where Greer's door had caught her, and she didn't have the energy to perform toughness right now. I learn fast. Livestock takes time to learn, he said, but it's not complicated mostly. It's just daily. He was quiet a moment. The house needs work, the cooking. I've been getting by, but getting by isn't the same as eating well. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved briefly across his face. I remember what eating well was like. Elena set down her coffee cup. Mr. Boone. Silas. She looked at him steadily. I want you to understand something. I am not looking for someone to take care of me. I'm looking for a place to work and be useful and raise my daughter without her sleeping outside. She paused. If that's what you're offering, I'll take it, and I'll give you everything I've got for it. If you're offering something else, tell me now. He looked at her without flinching. I'm offering work and a room, he said. That's the whole offer. Elena was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind pushed against the house and the stove ticked. Then yes, she said. I accept. She slept on the floor of the small room, rolled in her own coat, because the cot was narrow and Lila needed it, and she wasn't putting her daughter on a floor she didn't know yet. She was too tired to feel the floor being hard. She was too tired to feel much of anything except the warmth. Before she closed her eyes, she thought about the 8 doors. She thought about Greer's face in that brief gap before he slammed it. She thought about the minister with his apologetic eyes and his no-fun congregation and his list of names that hadn't worked out. She thought about Thomas, not his sick face, the one she'd been trying not to see lately, but his other face, his regular one, The one he'd made when he was listening to something he found interesting, tilted slightly to one side. 7 words, she thought, though she didn't know yet that was what they'd be. She'd find out later, when Lila was older and asked about it, and she'd think back to that first night and try to remember Silas's exact words, and realize they'd been so simple they barely registered as a thing. Come in out of the cold. But he'd meant them. That was the part. He'd meant every one of them. Lila woke at first light and immediately began a very serious whispered conversation about something Elena couldn't follow, which was normal. Elena lay still for a moment, listening to her daughter murmur to herself, and felt the strange, careful thing that was the first real breath she'd taken in months. Not safety. She wasn't foolish enough to call it safety yet, but something. Some very small margin of something that wasn't just the next problem. She got up. She found the kitchen. She found flour and salt and a tin of lard, and she put together biscuits. Real ones, not the dried-out pocket ones she'd been rationing, because it was the first concrete thing she could think of to do, and concrete things had gotten her this far. She was pulling them from the oven when she heard boots on the porch. Silas came in the back door, already moving like a man who'd been outside for an hour, and stopped when he smelled the kitchen. He looked at the biscuits. He looked at Elena. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, but a thing adjacent to it, like a man revising something he'd been sure of. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," Elena said. "Sit down. They're better hot." He sat down. He ate 3 biscuits and drank coffee and didn't say much, but there was something in the way he was sitting that was different from the night before. Slightly less guarded, or maybe just less solitary, like the house had remembered what it was for. Outside, the Wyoming morning was brutal and bright and entirely indifferent to both of them. The ranch was behind, Silas had said. Behind in every way a ranch can be behind without actually falling down. Elena looked out the window at what she could see of it. The fence that needed mending, the yard that needed clearing, the chicken coop that had a patch section that hadn't been patched well. She saw work. That was all she saw. Just work, arranged in front of her in the clearest possible terms. For the first time in 4 months, that felt exactly like enough. The biscuits were gone by the time Silas came back in from the second round of morning chores, and Elena had already started on the dishes. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the clean table, the wiped counter, the pot soaking in the basin. He didn't say anything about it. He poured himself more coffee and sat down and looked at his hands the way men do when they're thinking something they haven't decided to say yet. Elena dried her hands on a cloth and turned around. "What needs doing first?" He looked up. "You don't have to start today." "I know I don't have to." She said it without edge, just factually. "What needs doing?" Silas studied her for a moment with the same expression he'd had when he came in and smelled the biscuits, like he was revising something. Then he said, "The chicken coop's got a gap in the east wall. Cold's getting in and the hens know it. Production's been down." "I can patch a wall." "You know how to work with boards and nails?" Thomas showed me. She said his name easily, the way she'd been practicing, like a name that belonged to her history without bleeding all over the present. He wasn't handy by nature, but he worked at it. So did I. Silas nodded. "Lumber's in the barn. Left side stacked near the post. Nails are in the tin box on the workbench." "All right. You'll want gloves. There's an extra pair on the hook by the barn door." Elena got Lila settled first. This was the part of single motherhood that nobody talked about, the constant arithmetic of attention, the way every task had a second task embedded in it called, "And what do I do with Lila while I do that?" She brought the child into the main room, arranged 3 pots and a wooden spoon on the floor near the stove where it was warm, and explained very seriously that Lila was in charge of the pots while Mama worked. Lila considered this responsibility with enormous gravity and began immediately hitting all 3 pots in rotation. Elena went to fix the chicken coop. It took her longer than it should have because the gap was larger than Silas had described. It always was, when someone else described a repair job, because the person describing it hadn't been out there on their knees with the wind coming through and the hens watching suspiciously from the far corner. She had to pull 2 rotten boards entirely and replace them, which meant measuring twice with a piece of string and no ruler, and cutting with a handsaw that was sharp enough but heavy, and her arms ached by the time she got the second board nailed in. But she got it done. She stood back and checked her work with the same critical eye Thomas had taught her. Not asking, "Is it good enough?" but asking, "Will it hold?" Different question. Better standard. it would hold. The hens seemed to sense the improvement because two of them moved back toward that wall and settled down with the resigned satisfaction of creatures who'd been making do and were done with it. Elena wiped sawdust off her sleeves and went back inside to check on Lila, and found Silas already in there, sitting on the floor cross-legged with an expression of mild bewilderment, while Lila placed a pot on his head with great deliberateness. He was letting her. Elena stopped in the doorway. He didn't look embarrassed about it. He just looked at Elena and said, "She's decided I'm a hat rack, apparently." "She does that." Elena came in and collected the pot from his head and handed it back to Lila, who immediately began reconsidering her options. "Sorry, she's not usually shy." "Nothing to be sorry about." He got up from the floor with the particular effort of a man whose knees had opinions about cold mornings. "Coup-up fixed?" "Had to replace 2 boards, not 1, but it's solid." He went to the window and looked out at the coop, though from this angle he couldn't see anything useful. It seemed like a reflex, something to do while he processed information. 2 boards. The rot went further than the gap, wasn't worth leaving them. He turned back from the window. "What's your rate?" Elena blinked. "What? What were you expecting to be paid? Per week? Per month? What number did you have in mind when you said you were looking for work?" Nobody had asked her that directly. The conversation she'd imagined on the road from door to door had gone many different ways, but none of them had started with the employer asking her what she wanted. She'd been prepared to take whatever was offered and feel grateful for it. "I don't—" She stopped. Tried again. "I hadn't settled on a number." "Then settle on one now." She looked at him carefully. "You're going to counter whatever I say." "Probably," he said. "That's how this works." Elena thought about the $35 she had left. She'd used 2 of it yesterday, a biscuit and a cup of something in a Dunmore shop before she'd started the rounds of doors. She thought about what it cost to live, roughly, and what she'd need for Lila, and what the room and board here was worth on the open market, and what she could reasonably expect a man in a modest Wyoming ranch to pay a woman with no formal references and a toddler underfoot. She named a number. It was modest. She wasn't trying to gouge him. Silas looked at her steadily and named a number back that was 20% higher. Elena stared at him. "You fixed the coop in one morning," he said, "including replacing boards that weren't on my list. I'm not interested in paying you for what I thought the job was if you did more than that." She didn't know what to do with that, so she just said, "All right." "All right," he agreed, and that was that. The thing about the Boone Ranch that became apparent over the first week was that it wasn't broken so much as it was neglected, and neglect and broken were different problems with different solutions. Broken meant starting over. Neglect meant catching up, which was a lot of work, but it was the right kind of work, the kind that showed results. The house had gotten dusty in the particular way of a space occupied by one person who doesn't notice dust because he's always outside. Elena moved through it methodically, not dramatically. She didn't tear everything apart and start over. She just worked her way from one end to the other, steadily, the way her mother had taught her. And her mother's mother before that. The kind of cleaning that doesn't announce itself, but just makes a room feel like it's been breathed back into. She found things in the process. A pair of woman's gloves in the back of a kitchen drawer, good leather, too small for Silas's hands. A photograph tucked inside a book on the shelf near the stove. A woman, younger than Elena, with light hair and a serious expression. She left the photograph where she found it and didn't ask. Some questions you learn to hold for the right moment. Most questions you learn to let go of entirely. Silas didn't explain the gloves or the photograph, and Elena didn't expect him to. He was a man who kept his history the way he kept his ranch. Not hidden, exactly, just not on display. You'd find out things by being around long enough, and only the things that were relevant. What she found out in that first week was simpler and more useful. He was up before dawn, out to the horses before the light was fully established, back in for coffee around 7. He ate what was put in front of him without commentary, which she took as a good sign. He worked past dark if he needed to and stopped when he was done, not when the clock said anything. He didn't make small talk. He wasn't unfriendly. He was just a man who lived the way a person lives when they've been alone long enough to forget the performance of company. Elena was the same in her way. She'd spent 4 months as the person everyone was worrying about, and it had exhausted her in a way the work never did. Here, nobody was worrying about her. Silas treated her the way he treated his tools and his fences, with practical respect, expecting them to do what they were supposed to do, taking care of them when they needed it. She found that she could breathe in a space like that. Lila was the variable. Lila, at 2 years old, was in the phase of childhood where the world is primarily a collection of things to climb on, put in her mouth, or explain at length to anyone willing to listen. Silas was almost always willing to listen, which was something Elena noticed and filed away quietly because it told her things. The first time she really noticed it was 4 days in. She was in the side yard turning over a vegetable bed that had gone fallow. Silas had mentioned it could be producing if someone got to it before the ground froze solid, and Elena had decided to take that as a directive. And she had Lila in the yard with her, which meant checking on her every 45 seconds or so, except she got focused on a stubborn patch of hardened soil and looked up, and Lila was gone. Not gone far. She was around the corner of the barn, and Elena found her because she could hear her, talking, in that earnest run-on way that 2-year-olds talk when they're explaining something crucial. She came around the corner and found Lila sitting in the dirt next to Silas, who was on his knee looking at a fence post and apparently being told about something called a big red, which might have been a dog or a wagon, or possibly an emotion. It was often hard to tell. Silas was listening, not in a polite, waiting for her to finish way. Actually listening, the way you listen to someone whose words matter to you, asking a question when she paused. Is that right? And what happened then? Even though the answers were entirely incomprehensible. Elena stood at the corner of the barn for a moment she probably shouldn't have stood there. She went back to the vegetable bed. Later, when Lila was asleep and Elena was mending a tear in one of her own shirts at the kitchen table, she said, "You're patient with her." Silas was at the other end of the table going over some papers. Accounts, it looked like, the kind of thing that builds up when you're too busy outside to deal with it inside. He looked up. "She's good company," he said. "She's working something out. I just don't want to be in her way." Elena turned that over. Most adults treat children like they need to be managed. Most adults aren't paying attention. He looked back at his papers. Elena looked back at her mending. Outside, the wind pushed against the house in a way that had become, in 4 days, familiar. Not comforting, exactly, but known. On the 8th day, she made a mistake. It wasn't a catastrophic mistake. It was the kind of mistake that accumulates from moving too fast and trusting her own confidence too much, which was a particular fault she was aware of in herself and hadn't managed to fix yet. She'd been learning the livestock from Silas by following alongside and watching and asking questions when she had them. He was a good teacher in the unpretentious way. He didn't explain things in long paragraphs. He showed you and expected you to watch, and then try it. The horses were the thing she was still cautious about. She'd been around horses but not worked with them, and there's a difference between being around a horse and working with one. She knew that difference, and she'd been appropriately humble about it. But that morning Silas had gone to the far edge of the property to check on the winter fence line, which took most of the morning, and while he was gone, one of the mares, the brown one they called Pepper, who was difficult in a low-level way that meant she wasn't actively dangerous but wasn't cooperative either, had gotten her halter caught on a piece of wire in her stall. Elena could see the problem. She knew what needed to happen. Someone needed to get in the stall, calm the horse enough to get the halter free, and make sure no damage was done. She'd seen Silas do it with the other animals. She told herself she knew what she was doing. She didn't know what she was doing, not with Pepper. She got into the stall and Pepper immediately communicated through the language of her entire body that this was wrong. Not dangerous wrong, just wrong. The horse's version of "I don't trust you yet, and I'd like you to know that." Elena moved carefully and spoke low, and thought she was doing well, right up until the moment she reached for the halter, and Pepper shifted hard sideways, and Elena went into the stall wall shoulder first hard enough to see color for a second. She stood up. Pepper was still tangled. The halter was worse. Elena stood there in the stall breathing through her nose and making a systematic inventory of what she'd just done wrong and in what order. Silas found her like that when he came back 20 minutes later. Elena standing outside the stall with her hand on the gate, working out a different approach. Because the first approach wasn't available anymore, and the second approach needed more thinking. He looked at Pepper. He looked at Elena. He looked at the way Elena was holding her left shoulder without meaning to. "You tried to free her," he said. "And failed," Elena said. "I know." "You hurt?" "I'll be fine. Pepper wasn't trying to hurt me. She just didn't want me in there." She paused. "Which I should have known." Silas walked past her and went into the stall with the particular quality of movement he had around the horses. Not slow exactly, but careful, the kind of careful that doesn't look careful because it's become instinct. He had Pepper calm in about 2 minutes and the halter free in 4. He came back out and latched the gate. Elena was waiting for the part where he told her she'd been stupid. "You were right about the problem," Silas said. "Halter on the wire, needed freeing. That was the right call." "The method was wrong." "The method was wrong," he agreed. "But the read was right. Most people who don't know horses don't even get that far." He looked at her. "Your shoulder." "It's fine." "Elena." She stopped. Nobody had said her name like that in a while, not with that particular weight, not like a person who needed her to pay attention to something she was minimizing. "It's sore," she said, "not broken." "I know the difference," he said. "I've hit enough walls." He paused. "Come in. I've got liniment. Works on horses, works on people." She followed him inside and sat at the kitchen table while he got the liniment from the shelf, and he put it in front of her and left her to apply it herself, because he understood without being told that she'd need that much. She appreciated it more than she would have appreciated any other approach. What happened the following morning was quieter, but in some ways hit harder. She was in the kitchen before first light. She'd gotten in the habit of being up before Silas, not from obligation, but because she'd been an early riser all her life, and it was the only hour that felt entirely her own. She had the stove going and was thinking about bread, whether there was enough time before he'd need breakfast, when she heard him come in the back door from the horses and stop. She looked over her shoulder. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand and something on his face that she hadn't seen before. Not distress, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who'd been keeping a particular composure for a long time, and had just, for a moment, let it slip in a place where he thought he was alone. He hadn't expected her to be up yet. He put his hat back on and said, "Morning?" "Morning," she said. "Coffee's ready?" He came in and poured a cup and stood at the counter, and Elena busied herself with the bread assessment and didn't look at him directly, because she'd learned by then that he was the kind of person who needed not to be looked at when something was working through him. After a while he said, "You know what today is?" She thought. November. 2 weeks into November, she'd been keeping track. She shook her head. 3 years ago today, my wife left, he said. Not died, left. He said it in the same flat way she'd learned to say, Thomas died. The words that hurt so bad that you eventually drain them of everything except the fact, because the fact is all you can afford to carry. Took most of herself with her, and about half of what the ranch was then. I don't blame her, He stopped. I wasn't good at being married to. Elena set down the flour tin. She turned around and looked at him, which was what the moment needed, even if he didn't want it. I'm sorry, she said. I'm not telling you for sympathy. He looked at his coffee cup. I'm telling you because you found those gloves and that photograph and you didn't ask, and you deserve to know anyway. They were hers. Elena had kept the photograph where she'd found it, tucked in the book. I put them back where I found them. I know, I appreciate it. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not still in love with her, if that's the thing you're wondering. I'm just still in the habit of remembering things on certain days, whether I want to or not. That doesn't go away, Elena said. The remembering on certain days. He looked at her. No? No. It just changes shape. She turned back to the counter and measured flour. The first time I made biscuits after Thomas died, I burned them. I don't burn biscuits. But I was thinking about how he took them apart from the outside in, which was the wrong way to eat a biscuit, and I left them too long. She paused. Now I can make them without thinking about that. But sometimes I still choose to think about it. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, the outside in is the wrong way. Completely wrong. You start from the middle. She glanced at him. No question. Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. All right, she agreed and went back to the bread. What? The first time she heard him laugh was a week after that, and it happened because of Lila. It was evening. Elena was folding the week's laundry at the table, and Silas was supposed to be reviewing the accounts he'd been avoiding for 2 weeks, and Lila was supposed to be asleep, but had instead gotten out of the cot and wandered in wearing her nightshirt and one sock. The other one had gone to the same dimension where all children's socks apparently go, carrying a wooden spoon she'd found somewhere during the day and kept as her own. She walked up to Silas, considered him for a moment, and put the spoon on the account papers. Silas looked at the spoon. He looked at Lila. "What's this for?" he said. Lila said something entirely confident and entirely unintelligible, pointing at the spoon, then at him, then at the papers, in a sequence that suggested a complete logic. "I see," he said, in a tone that indicated he absolutely did not see. Lila picked up the spoon, tapped the papers twice, apparently for emphasis, and put it back. And Silas Boone laughed. Not a polite chuckle, not a careful ha. An actual laugh. Surprised out of him, the kind that happens before you can decide whether to have it or not. It lasted about 3 seconds, and then he got it back under control, but the echo of it stayed in the room. Elena kept her eyes on the laundry. She was smiling. She couldn't help that, but she kept it to the folding. Lila, satisfied with the reception, picked up her spoon and went back to bed. What? The trouble came from Dunmore, as trouble in small towns usually does. Not in a sudden way, but in the gradual way of talk that builds and shifts and arrives eventually at your door with a shape you didn't see coming. Elena found out about it from a woman named Ruth Gables, who came by the ranch on a Tuesday morning to return a tool she'd borrowed from Silas before Elena arrived. Ruth was 50 or so, competent looking, with the particular directness of a woman who'd been practical her whole life and had no patience left over for decoration. She looked at Elena with an open curiosity that wasn't unfriendly. "You're the woman Silas took in." "I'm the woman Silas hired," Elena said, which was not a correction she made aggressively, just a fact that needed to be the right shape. Ruth handed over the tool, a fence stretcher, heavy, meant for wire, and looked past Elena at the house, then back at her. "You should know there's talk in town." Elena had been expecting this. It would have been strange if there wasn't. "What kind of talk?" "The usual kind," Ruth said. "Young widow living at a single man's ranch. 2 and 2 getting made into 5. She said it without judgment, just report. Silas has a reputation for being private, and people fill in private with whatever they've got. What are people filling it with? Some say he's soft. Some say he's foolish. Some... She paused. "Margaret Holmes been talking. She says you left debts behind in Casper." Elena went very still. "I left no debts." "I didn't say I believed it. I said she's talking." Ruth looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you because I think you have a right to know what's being said about you." "Does Silas know?" "I don't know what Silas knows. He doesn't come to town much." Elena stood there on the porch, holding the door and feeling something work its way through her that was partly anger and partly something older and more tired. The knowledge that a woman alone with a child is always one piece of gossip away from losing whatever ground she's gained, and that the losing of it requires no truth at all. "Thank you for telling me," she said, and meant it. Ruth nodded. "For what it's worth," she said. "This place looks better than it has in 2 years. He needed help." "He's been working hard," Elena said. "I can see what's been working hard," Ruth said, not unkindly, and went back to her wagon. So, Elena thought about not telling Silas. She thought about it the way you think about a decision you've already made, but haven't admitted to yet. She'd handle it herself. It was her reputation being talked about, and she'd been managing her own problems since before Thomas got sick. But she was in his house. It was his name attached to whatever story was circulating, and she'd told him, the first night, that she'd rather he knew the situation than made assumptions about it. That went both ways. She told him that evening after dinner, with Lila already asleep, laying it out the same way she'd laid out her situation on his porch. Just the facts, organized plainly, without either drama or minimization. Silas listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "Margaret Holm," he said. "Yes." "She and Thomas's aunt were friends." Elena hadn't known that. "I didn't know that." "I don't know why she'd be angry at you, unless she thinks..." He stopped. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite readable. Sometimes people get angry at the living when they think the living got away with something. "What did I get away with?" "Surviving," he said simply. "Some people find that offensive." Elena looked at him. "What are you going to do about the talk?" "Nothing. Nothing. Talk dies when there's nothing to feed it." He looked at his coffee cup. "Unless you want to leave. If it's affecting you..." "I'm not leaving over Margaret Holmes' gossip," Elena said. The firmness in her own voice surprised her a little. "I'm asking what you want to do, not suggesting I go." He looked at her then, and something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a degree, like something he'd been holding at arm's length had gotten half a step closer. "Then we do nothing," he said, "and we let the work speak." The work speaks fine, Elena said, but talk doesn't always need to hear it. No, he agreed, but we live here and Margaret Holm lives in town, and that's the better arrangement as far as I can tell. Elena thought about that for a moment and decided he was right. All right, she washed the cups. He went back to the accounts he'd been avoiding. The stove worked. Outside it was starting to snow, the first real snow of the season, light and testing, the kind that was more announcement than event. Elena watched it through the window for a moment. She thought about the night she'd come through that gate, and the 7 doors before it, and Greer's door against her face. She thought about how small the margin had been. One more door, one more night, and something different would have happened, and she didn't let herself think about what. She thought about Lila in the next room, asleep with the wooden spoon probably tucked under her pillow, where she'd started keeping her most important possessions. She thought, you can't outrun what people choose to think about you. You can only keep doing the thing you're there to do. Thomas had told her something like that once, phrased differently, in the way that Thomas had phrased things, with too many words and a kind of cheerful certainty that she'd found both annoying and comforting in roughly equal measure. She missed it. She missed all of his particular irritating qualities, which was the part of grief nobody warned you about, that you'd miss the things that used to make you crazy. She turned away from the window and went to bed. The town trip came 3 weeks in, and it was necessary rather than optional. They were low on flour and salt and a few things for the horses that couldn't be improvised, and Elena had been managing the household accounts well enough that she knew to the dollar what they needed and what it would cost. Silas said he'd go alone. Elena said she'd come with him. There was a brief silence. You don't have to, he said. I know I don't have to. She already had her coat on. Lila was in hers, fighting the mittens with the focused resistance that had become her position on mittens. If there's talk, walking away from it doesn't help. Walking through it does. Or it makes it worse. Then it makes it worse, Elena said, and got the second mitten on Lila. Let's go. He drove. Elena sat on the wagon seat with Lila between them and watched the Wyoming morning pass and didn't say much, and neither did Silas, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who'd gotten past the part where silence needs to be filled. Dunmer was small enough that they were noticed before they reached the feed store. Elena felt it the way you feel weather, not seeing it exactly, just registering the change in the air, the looks that were slightly too casual, the conversations that paused at the wrong moment. She kept her spine straight and her expression even and walked into the feed store with Lila on her hip and gave her order to the man behind the counter with the same voice she used for everything. The man, his name was Cotter, she'd learned it from Silas, was looking at her with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not hostile, not exactly warm, something measuring. Mrs. Mercer, he said, Mr. Cotter, you're working out at the Boone place. I am. Going all right? Very well, she said. And then, because she'd made a decision about this walking in, she looked at him directly and said, I appreciate you asking. I know there's been some talk. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Nothing I put much stock in. Good, she said pleasantly. Neither do I. She gave him the rest of the order. He filled it. She paid him and thanked him and walked out. Silas was loading flour into the wagon bed. He looked at her. Fine, she said, before he could ask. Cotter's not the problem anyway, Silas said. He minds his own business more than most. I know, it was practice. He looked at her sharply. Practice for what? She nodded across the street. Margaret Holm was standing outside the dry goods store, looking at them with an expression that had too much in it to unpack at this distance. Silas looked. He made a sound low in his throat that wasn't a word. You don't have to come, Elena said. I'm just going to say hello. Elena, I'm not going to make a scene, she said. I'm going to be so polite she'll have nothing to work with. She crossed the street with Lila still on her hip. She could feel Silas watching from behind her. Margaret Holmes saw her coming and had the option of going into the dry goods store, which would have been retreat, and chose not to take it, which told Elena something about the woman's particular kind of pride. Mrs. Holm, Elena said, pleasantly, the voice she'd used with Cotter. Good morning. Margaret Holm was a woman in her 60s with a tight, careful face. She looked at Elena and then at Lila and then at something over Elena's shoulder that was probably Silas. Mrs. Mercer, she said. I heard you've been concerned about me, Elena said. That's kind of you. I want you to know I'm well. Lila's well. She shifted Lila on her hip. Lila, with her extraordinary sense of theater, chose this moment to beam at Margaret Holm with the full force of a 2-year-old who has decided someone is interesting. Margaret Holm looked at Lila. Something flickered in her expression. Thomas would have wanted her taken care of, Elena said. Quiet, without accusation, just a fact. He was a man who took care of things. I'm doing the same. There was a silence. Margaret Holm looked at Lila for another moment, and then back at Elena and said, very stiffly, I hope you're doing well. We are, Elena said. Thank you. She walked back across the street. She loaded herself and Lila into the wagon. Silas climbed up beside her and picked up the reins and didn't say anything until they were out of town and on the open road. What did you say to her? He said. Nothing that wasn't true. She looked... He paused. She looked like someone had moved something she'd been sure was nailed down. Elena looked at the road ahead. The snow from the night before was still on the fields, thin and even, and the sky was the particular winter blue that Wyoming did so well, enormous and cold and indifferent to everything below it. She wasn't angry at me, Elena said. Not really. She was angry at the situation and I was the nearest available face for it. That's generous. Maybe. She paused. Thomas borrowed money from her husband once, before I knew him. Paid it back, but it took 2 years. And Mr. Holm died in between, so she never quite let it go. She said it without bitterness, just understanding. She wasn't ever going to think well of Thomas's widow. That's not about me. Silas was quiet for a moment. You knew all this? I found out, asked around, those first days in Dunmore before I ran out of doors to knock on. She looked at him. I like to understand the situation I'm in. He gave her a look that was somewhere between impressed and slightly unsettled. You do that a lot. Gather information quietly. Habit, she said. You learn fast what it costs not to know things. He seemed to think about that. Lila, wedged between them and warm from her coat, had fallen asleep against Elena's arm with her mitten finally won and lost again, and her bare hand tucked under her chin. Silas looked at Lila for a moment and then back at the road. She does that everywhere, he said. Just falls asleep. She trusts where she is, Elena said. It came out more simply than she'd intended, and more true, and she left it there in the air between them, where they both could hear what it meant without either of them having to address it directly. The wagon moved. The road went on. The snow held the fields quiet, and the sky held everything else. By the time they reached the ranch gate, Lila had stolen Silas's glove from his coat pocket in her sleep, which was something none of them could explain later, but which seemed, for whatever reason, to matter. Silas's glove turned up 3 days later inside Lila's pillowcase, which was where Lila had apparently decided it belonged. And when Elena found it and brought it back to him, he looked at it for a moment and then put it back in his coat pocket without a word. But the corner of his mouth did something he didn't entirely control. That was December now. The ranch had changed shape in the weeks since Elena arrived. Not dramatically, not the way houses change in stories where everything gets fixed and painted and made new, but in the small accumulated ways that told you someone was paying attention. The kitchen smelled like food instead of just coffee and wood smoke. The porch steps had been re-nailed so they didn't shift. The vegetable bed Elena had turned over before the ground hardened was covered now in a layer of straw that would hold the soil through winter and give it a better start in spring. The chickens were producing again. Silas had said nothing about any of it directly, but he'd started leaving the kitchen lamp on when he went out in the mornings, which he hadn't done before, and Elena understood this as the thing it was, a small gesture from a man who didn't make large ones. She was learning him the way you learn a place you've decided to stay in. Not all at once, not in any organized way, but accumulating, piece by piece, until you stop being surprised by things. What she knew, he'd built the ranch from almost nothing in his mid-20s, inherited the land, but not much else from a father who'd been better at acquiring property than at working it. He'd built it up over 10 years, gotten it to a real working operation, married a woman named Clara who'd lasted 4 years before the distance between what the ranch required and what she'd been expecting turned into a distance that couldn't be crossed. He didn't speak about Clara with bitterness, which told Elena more than bitterness would have. He spoke about her the way you speak about a decision that hurt, but wasn't wrong. At least not wrong for Clara. What she didn't know, what he wanted from the next 10 years. Whether the ranch was still the thing it had been before Clara left, or whether it had become more habit than purpose. whether the quietness he carried was the comfortable kind or the kind that came from having stopped expecting anything. She noticed she was curious about these things. She noticed that and then left it alone, the way you leave something alone that might move if you stop watching it. The letter came on a Wednesday in the second week of December, and it arrived with the small amount of mail Silas got. Mostly accounts, occasionally something from a cattlemen's organization he was nominally part of, in the saddlebag of the Dunmore postal rider who came out this way twice a week. Elena recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she turned it over because she'd seen it on a promissory note Thomas had kept in his desk drawer, the one she'd found when she was going through his papers after the funeral. It was from her brother-in-law, Thomas's younger brother, Daniel Mercer, who lived in Colorado and who Elena had met exactly twice, once at her wedding and once at Thomas's funeral, where he'd stood at the back and left before the end. She took the letter inside and stood at the kitchen counter and opened it. It was short. 3 paragraphs, written in the careful hand of a man who'd been composing it for a while. The first paragraph asked after her health and Lila's, which was courtesy only. You could feel the prelude in it. The second paragraph said that he'd heard she was staying at the Boone Ranch outside Dunmore, and he hoped it was a respectable arrangement. That word, respectable, was underlined in a way that made its meaning clear without making its judgment explicit. The third paragraph said that he was writing on behalf of himself and his wife, who were unable to have children of their own, and who had spoken with a lawyer in Denver, and who believed that Lila might be better served by a 2-parent household with stable means, and that if Elena was willing to discuss the matter, he was prepared to make reasonable financial arrangements to cover any transition difficulties Elena might face. She read it twice. Then she put it on the counter and looked at it like it was a thing that had crawled in from outside. He was asking for Lila. In the language of legal courtesy and financial reasonableness, he was asking if Elena would give up her daughter. She stood there for a long time, not thinking, exactly, more like letting the initial wave of it move through her, because she'd learned the hard way that reacting to the wave was always worse than waiting for it to pass. The wave passed. Under it was something clean and cold and very, very certain. She was not giving him Lila. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and went back out to the vegetable bed, which didn't need anything done to it, but gave her somewhere to put her hands. She told Silas that evening, same as she'd told him about Margaret Holmes' talk, not because she needed his help with it, but because she was in his house, and it was his life being adjacent to hers, and he deserved to know what was moving around in it. He read the letter without expression, set it on the table, looked at it for a moment. "He can't take her," Elena said. "I know that. I'm her mother. I have all rights. There's nothing a lawyer in Denver can do that changes that." "No," Silas agreed, "but he might try. And if he tries, it costs money. Lawyers cost money." She was keeping her voice level, which required some work. "I have a little put by now from what you've been paying me. Not enough for a legal fight." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Would he actually do it?" he said. "Or is this—" he gestured at the letter. "Is this the opening move to something else?" Elena thought about Daniel Mercer standing at the back of the church, the way his wife, a thin, controlled woman whose name Elena kept failing to retain, had watched the small casket flowers with an expression that had something wanting in it. "He and his wife want a child," she said. "That part is real. Lila is Thomas's daughter." She paused. "I think he genuinely believes he'd be offering her something better. Better than her mother. Better than this." She gestured vaguely, which encompassed the modest house, the Wyoming winter, the situation. Silas looked at the letter again. "He doesn't know what this is." "No, he knows I was knocking on doors in October, which somebody told him, and he's drawn a picture from that." "Who told him?" Elena had been thinking about that. "Margaret Holmes would be my first guess. She'd know someone in Casper who'd know Daniel." She said it without heat. "It doesn't matter who. What matters is what I do about it." Silas looked at her steadily. "What are you going to do?" "Write back," she said. "Tell him no. Tell him clearly, without anger, no." She paused. "And if he pushes it to a lawyer, I'll find a way to handle that." "You could have a lawyer write back instead of you." "I can't afford—" "I know a man in Cheyenne," Silas said. "Not expensive, old family friend. He'd write a letter for next to nothing if I asked him." Elena looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." He said it exactly the way she'd said it to him, half a dozen times, about half a dozen things. The repetition of her own words, used back at her, was so deliberate that she almost smiled despite everything. Do you want me to write to him or not? She thought about it. The pride part of her, the part that had been managing its own problems since October, said no, she could handle this, in for one more thing. The practical part, which was louder, said, Lila. Yes, she said. Please, Mate. Silas wrote the letter to his friend in Cheyenne that same evening, and the friend, a man named Harlow, apparently, who had the name of a man who'd been born into a different century and thrived in it, wrote back within the week with a response that was 2 pages of legal language Elena could barely parse, but which Silas summarized as, Daniel Mercer has no legal ground whatsoever, and his lawyer should know that before wasting anyone's time. The response went out to Daniel Mercer in Colorado. There was no reply. Not for 2 weeks. Elena waited for one, the way you wait for weather you've been warned about. Not constantly, but with a background awareness that it was still a possibility. The reply when it came was a single sentence. I understand. I wish you and the child well. Elena read it and put it in the stove. She watched it burn and felt the tightness in her chest release in a way she hadn't quite let herself feel until this moment. She'd been holding it locked down since the first letter arrived, because you can't function at full capacity while also being afraid, and she'd needed to function. Lila, who had been nearby engaged in her ongoing project of reorganizing the lower kitchen shelf, chose this moment to bring Elena a tin cup as an offering. Thank you, Elena said. Lila patted her knee seriously and went back to the shelf. Elena sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on it and took a slow breath, and she let herself have the feeling she'd been not having for 2 weeks, which was something between relief and fury and the particular exhaustion of having fought a thing that should never have been asked of her. She was still sitting like that when Silas came in from the barn. He saw her hands on the table. He saw her face. He didn't ask. He got 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of her and sat down across, and that was the whole of what was needed. What? January hit the ranch like it meant it personally. The cold that settled in the first week of the new year was a different order of cold from what Elena had been managing. Not the biting cold of October or the steady grinding cold of December, but something deeper and less negotiable, the kind that got into the walls of the house and made the wood stove work twice as hard for the same result. The horses needed extra feed. The water troughs were freezing solid before mid-morning and had to be broken twice a day. One of the cows, a red and white brindled thing that Silas called Vera for reasons he'd never explained, developed a cough that required monitoring and twice daily checking and a worried kind of attention that reminded Elena uneasily of Thomas's last months. She mentioned that to Silas without meaning to, one evening while they were both in the barn, her holding the lamp while he checked Vera's breathing. She sounds like Thomas did, she said, at the beginning. Silas was listening to the cow with the focused attention of a man who'd been reading animal health for 30 years. Different kind of cough, he said. Hers is in the chest. His was... He stopped. She looked at him. You knew he was sick? Not for a long time. He straightened up, still looking at Vera. I heard it at the autumn auction, last year. Someone mentioned he'd been ill. He paused. I thought about going by. Didn't. Why not? He was quiet. Didn't know him well enough to know if it would be welcome or just another thing he had to manage. He looked at her. I'm sorry I didn't. Elena thought about the autumn auction, which Thomas hadn't been able to go to because by then sitting upright for long periods was getting difficult. He wouldn't have been. It would have been fine, she said. He liked company. More than I do, actually. That right? He talked to strangers in the time it took me to figure out if I wanted to. She leaned against the stall post. He would have talked to you for an hour and known your whole history and given you his view of it. And you? I'd have been over here with the cow trying to figure out if she needed a vet. That got a sound out of him, half a laugh, or the cousin of one. He looked back at Vera. She probably doesn't need a vet, but I want to watch her another day. I'll check her first thing, Elena said. I know you will. He said it like it was the easiest thing in the world, like it was already a fact he'd organized his planning around. I know you will. She registered that on her way back out of the barn, and she didn't look at it directly, just noted its shape and kept walking. Vera recovered by the end of the week. The cold did not. February came in with 2 successive storms that kept them close to the ranch for days at a stretch. The kind of isolation that tests whatever's actually true between two people because there's nowhere to go and nothing to do but be in the same space and find out what that reveals. Elena had been worried about this in an abstract way. Not about Silas specifically, but about the general principle of close quarters and the things that could go wrong in them. What she found out was that close quarters with Silas was not substantially different from regular quarters with Silas. He didn't get crowded. He didn't get difficult. He got quieter, if anything. The kind of quiet that was contented rather than withdrawn. A man who was genuinely all right being exactly where he was. It made the house feel, against any expectation Elena might have had, more spacious rather than less. Lila was the one who got cabin fever. By the 3rd day of the 2nd February storm, Lila had exhausted every available entertainment the house offered. The pots, the spoon, the lower shelf project, a set of buttons Elena had given her to sort and resort, and had entered a phase of focused discontent that expressed itself mostly through climbing on things she wasn't supposed to climb on, and standing on them and looking at Elena with a specific expression that communicated, quite clearly, your move. Silas watched this for most of a morning with the expression of a man observing a natural phenomenon he finds genuinely interesting. "She needs to go outside," he said. "It's 12 degrees and blowing," Elena said. "She needs to go outside for about 15 minutes. "Silas, I bundled up worse than she will be when I was her age." He was already reaching for his coat. "My mother used to send me outside in weather like this because she said I was making the walls feel close." Elena looked at Lila, who had climbed on the chair and was now considering the table. "Was your mother right?" "Always," he said, "even when she was wrong." They bundled Lila into everything available, which resulted in a child so thoroughly wrapped that she could barely bend her arms, and took her outside into the knife-edge cold for exactly 16 minutes, during which Lila discovered snow in a way that suggested she'd encountered it before but had never been formally introduced to it in a quantity that required a response. She sat down in it. She picked up handfuls and dropped them. She looked at the sky with her mouth open and caught snowflakes on her tongue, which made her laugh, really laugh, the full-body laugh of a small child delighted by something entirely simple. Elena stood next to Silas watching this and felt something shift under her ribs that she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness, exactly. Or not only happiness, more like recognition, like something she'd thought she'd lost had put its hand on her shoulder from behind, and she'd turned around. And there it was. She didn't say anything. Silas didn't either. They just stood there in the cold watching Lila conduct her scientific investigation of snow until the cold worked past Lila's bundling and she announced, with characteristic firmness, that she was done. They went inside. Elena made hot milk. The storm pushed against the house and the stove worked and Lila fell asleep in the chair with milk on her upper lip and snow melt drying in her hair. Silas looked at her sleeping and said quietly so as not to wake her, "You're good at this." "At what?" "At her." He said it simply. "You know how to... You don't manage her. You just know her." Elena looked at Lila sleeping. "She's easy to know. She tells you everything she's thinking." "So do you," he said, just differently. Elena looked at him. He was looking at Lila still, which made it easier for her to look at him, and she studied his profile for a moment. The jaw that needed a shave, the tired set of his shoulders from the week of extra work, the way his hands were resting loose on his knees. "I'm not that easy to know," she said. "No," he agreed, "but you're honest, which is its own kind of communication." She looked back at Lila. "Thomas said I was the hardest person to know he'd ever met." "Did he mean it as a complaint?" "He meant it as a compliment." She paused. "He said most people were easy to know because they told you what they wanted you to think. He said I was hard to know because I didn't do that, so everything you learned was actually true." Silas was quiet for a moment. He was right. He usually was, Elena said, about other people. He was less accurate about himself. In what way? He thought he was tougher than he was. He thought he could push through things that needed rest. She said it without bitterness, just retrospect. He didn't rest enough the first 2 months. I think it mattered. She didn't say, I think if he'd rested, he might have lived. She didn't know if that was true, and she'd decided not to carry it as though it were, because that was the kind of thing you could carry forever, and it would only get heavier. Silas seemed to understand this because he didn't pursue it. He just said, He sounds like someone who was hard on himself. Very. She glanced at him. So are you. He seemed surprised by that. You think so? I think you've been running this ranch alone and telling yourself it's fine when it hasn't been, because asking for help felt like admitting something you weren't willing to admit. He looked at her steadily. What would I have been admitting? That Clara leaving changed more than the arrangements, she said. That it changed what you thought you were worth, maybe. What you thought you deserved. The silence that followed that was a different kind of silence from the usual ones between them. It had weight. She'd gone further than she'd meant to, or maybe exactly as far as she'd meant to without having known she was going there. Silas looked at the stove. You're probably right, he said finally. I'm not trying to... I know you're not. He looked back at her. I said you're probably right. I wasn't objecting. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in the air between them had shifted its arrangement, very slightly, and they were both aware of it, and neither of them moved toward it or away from it. They just left it there, the way you leave something that needs time before it's clear what it is. I should put Lila to bed properly, Elena said. Yeah, Silas said. She carried Lila to the back room and tucked her in and stood there for a moment in the dark, same as she'd stood on the first night. But everything was different now in ways she hadn't cataloged yet, and wasn't sure she should. The storm that changed everything came in on a Thursday in late February without the kind of warning that would have been useful. There had been weather all month. That was the thing. You got so accustomed to bad weather that you stopped reading the specific quality of it, the way city people stop hearing traffic. Elena had noticed it was darker than usual in the early afternoon, and the horses had been restless in a way that was different from ordinary restlessness. And she'd mentioned it to Silas, who'd said he'd noticed it too and they should make sure everything was secured, but they'd both thought, and she'd think about this later, when she could think about things clearly, they'd both thought it was another storm like the ones they'd already survived. It was not another storm like the ones they'd already survived. The first sign was the sound. Elena was in the kitchen with Lila when she heard it. Not wind, exactly, or not only wind. Something larger than wind, something that started at the edge of hearing and built. The way sound builds when a train is coming and you're on the track and you can't yet see it. But you know, from the sound alone, that the time for standing still is already gone. She picked up Lila and went to the window. The sky to the northwest had turned the color of something that has no right being that color. Greenish-black. The particular hue that experienced weather watchers recognize and people who don't know better just find strange. The line of it was moving fast. Too fast. Moving the way weather moves when it's not a front but a wall. She had Lila on her hip and her coat in her other hand before Silas came through the back door, and she could see from his face that he'd seen it too and was already in the calculating part of his brain. Horses, he said. I know. I need to get them to the back stall. The northwest wall's the strongest. If it... He stopped. You need to stay in. I need to help you. Elena, 3 horses, she said. In this. She gestured at the window where the sky was getting worse with every second she stood looking at it. You can't move 3 panicking horses alone and you know it. He looked at her for half a second with the particular look of a man who knows he's wrong and is deciding how fast to admit it. Lila... I'll put her in the back room with the quilt and the door latched. She was already moving toward the back. She'll stay. She knows how to stay. Lila, reading the room with the accuracy of a child who'd been paying attention to her mother's voice for 2 years, did not protest being put down. She looked at Elena with her serious face and said, Stay? Stay, Elena confirmed. Right here. Don't open the door. She wasn't sure a 2-year-old could reliably follow those instructions. She was sure she had no other choice. She closed the door, tested the latch, heard Lila immediately begin talking to the wooden spoon, which was as good a sign as she was going to get. She grabbed her coat and gloves and went out the back with Silas into the beginning of the worst storm either of them had seen. The wind hit her like a physical object. Not metaphorically. It actually knocked her sideways, 1 step before she got her footing. The cold in it was a different temperature from the cold they'd been living in. This was the cold from somewhere north that has no softening, the cold that gets into your lungs and makes breathing into labor. Silas was already at the barn. She was right behind him. The horses knew. That was the thing about horses in front of serious weather. They weren't confused or manageable. They were electric with knowledge. All 3 of them were moving in their stalls with the tight, urgent motion of animals that need to run and can't. And the sound they were making was underneath the wind, but you could feel it in your chest. "Rio first," Silas said. Rio was the biggest of the three, a bay gelding, and the most likely to be the one the others followed. Smart horse, usually. Right now he looked like he was reconsidering every decision he'd ever made. "Tell me what to do," Elena said. "Take his lead. Don't pull. Move with him. If he goes sideways, you go sideways with him. Don't get between him and the door." He looked at her. "If he gets away from you, let him go." "He won't get away from me." "Elena, tell me what to do next," she said. They moved Rio first, Silas at his head and Elena on his left flank, one hand on his neck reading the tension in him, the way Silas had shown her. Not trying to overpower it, just staying in it, being a familiar pressure that said, "You're not alone in this," which was all you could offer a frightened horse, and sometimes it was enough. Rio fought them for the first 20 yards, and then something shifted and he came along, still high and tight-necked, but moving. They got him into the back stall. They went back for the other two. The storm was fully on them by the second horse, a roan mare who was less rational than Rio and more inclined to panic, and she did panic, mid-transfer, and Elena felt the lead rope burn through her glove before she got her other hand on it. The rope caught on the edge of her palm and the cold made it worse, and she held on. She held on. The mare came around. They got her in. By the time they went for Pepper, contrary, difficult Pepper, who still didn't entirely trust Elena and had the wall bruise to prove it, the wind was making it hard to hear anything else, and the first hard pellets of sleet were mixing with the snow and finding every gap in clothing with the focused malice of something that wanted in. Pepper backed against the far wall of her stall and showed the whites of her eyes. "She won't come for me," Elena said. Silas was already at the stall door. "She will now." He looked at Elena. "She'll come for you now. She's more scared of the storm than she is of you." "That's not a great compliment." "It's what we've got." He held the stall door. "Talk to her. Same voice you use for Lila when she's upset." Elena looked at Pepper. Pepper looked back at her with the eyes of an animal who was making rapid decisions about relative threats. "Hey," Elena said, not loud. Under the storm. The voice she used for Lila at 2 a.m, when Lila woke up confused and needed talking back to safe. "Hey, it's okay. I've got you. You're coming with me." She moved into the stall slowly. Pepper's ears flattened. Elena kept talking. Not words exactly, just the steady low register of a voice that wasn't afraid or was pretending well enough that it amounted to the same thing, and she got her hand on Pepper's neck and she said, "We're going now, come on." Pepper moved. She didn't come easily. She came in the way frightened things come when they decide the known alternative is worse than the unknown one. Reluctant, braced, still looking for a reason to bolt. But she came. Elena walked her out of the stall and into the full blast of the storm, and Pepper lurched sideways once, and Elena went with her, both of them staggering, and Silas was there on the other side, and between the two of them, they got her to the back stall and latched the door. The sound of the 3 horses in the back stall was better immediately. Still high, but together. Animals needed together. People did too. "Fence," Silas said. The west fence was already showing damage. 2 sections down, Elena could see it even through the blur of the storm, the wire pulling loose from posts that had been solid this morning. If it went all the way, it would leave the property open, and in this weather anything that got out wasn't coming back. They worked the fence for 40 minutes. Elena stopped being cold somewhere in the first 10, which was not actually a good sign, but meant she could work without being distracted by it. Silas worked beside her in a focused silence, both of them moving in the way you move when you've run out of reserves and are running on the thing underneath the reserves, that harder and quieter engine that you don't access on ordinary days. Her hand stopped working properly in the last section. She could see what needed doing. The wire needed to go around the post and be fastened, and the post itself was leaning and needed to be hammered back, which she'd been doing with a mallet Silas had brought. And she swung the mallet and mostly missed and swung again and got it. And Silas was watching her hands without saying anything, and she got the wire fastened before she let herself look at her palm, where the rope burn from the roan mare had opened in the cold. Not badly, just enough to matter. Silas saw it when they finally got back into the barn. He didn't make a thing of it. He just went to the shelf where he kept the liniment and the other supplies and came back with bandage cloth, and she let him wrap it because her hands were clumsy from the cold, and she wasn't too proud to admit that much. He wrapped it with the concentration of a man doing a thing he wanted to do correctly. The storm was at its peak outside. They could hear it moving over the barn roof with the sound of something that had weight and purpose. And the horses had settled in the back stall into the breathing rhythm of animals that are frightened but held. "You held Pepper," Silas said, not looking up from the bandaging. "She decided to come." "She didn't decide. You moved her." He tied off the bandage, looked at his work. "You've been working with her. I saw you. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to—" He stopped. "I didn't want to make you self-conscious about it." Elena looked at her wrapped hand. "I figured if I spent enough time near her, she'd get used to me." "She did more than get used to you." He let go of her hand, which he'd been holding, she realized, without either of them having marked the moment when that became the case. "She trusts you now." Elena thought about Pepper's neck under her hand in the storm, the way the horse had leaned into it, just slightly. "I know what it's like to be the animal that doesn't trust easily," she said. Seemed like the right approach. Silas looked at her for a moment. His face was weathered from the storm, and his jaw was dark with a few days of growth, and he looked exactly like what he was. A man in his barn in a Wyoming blizzard who had just worked alongside someone for 40 minutes in conditions that stripped every performance down to what was real. "The west fence held," she said. "It held. The horses are settled." "They are." "Then we did it." "We did," he said. It wasn't the kind of moment that announces itself. It wasn't romantic in the way that word gets used. No music, no particular light, just a cold barn and a wrapped hand, and two people who just found out something true about each other through the most honest possible means, which was working side by side in something that required everything. Elena became aware that she needed to go check on Lila, who had been behind a latched door in a loud storm for over an hour. "I have to," she said. "Go," he said. "I'll stay with the horses for a while." She went. She crossed the yard at a run. The storm was starting to ease now. The worst of it passed, but what it left behind was still serious cold and serious mess. And she got the back door open and went to the small room and unlatched it, and found Lila exactly where she'd left her, sitting cross-legged on the cot, with the quilt around her shoulders and the wooden spoon in her lap, looking at the door with an expression that was half relief and half reproach. "Mama," she said, in the tone of someone who has decided this absence requires acknowledgement. "I know," Elena said, picking her up, quilt and all. "I know. I'm here." Lila put her face in Elena's neck, and Elena stood in the middle of the small room holding her daughter and breathing, just breathing, and listening to the storm unwind itself outside. Her hand ached under the bandage. The ache felt specific and real, which meant she was warming up, which meant she was going to be fine. Lila was warm and smelled like sleep, and was already working through whether she was still annoyed. "Spoon," Lila said finally, offering it. Elena took the spoon. "Thank you." Lila seemed to accept this as resolution and settled her head back down on her mother's shoulder, and Elena stood there a little longer than necessary, holding the spoon and her daughter in the aftermath of the storm, in the house that had been becoming something she hadn't let herself name yet, but was getting closer to naming every day. Outside, the wind dropped. The horses breathed. The stove in the main room still had enough in it to hold warmth, and the west fence had held, and every animal on the property was accounted for. Silas came in an hour later, stomping snow off his boots, and found them both at the kitchen table. Lila asleep in Elena's lap, Elena with both hands around a cup of coffee, her bandaged palm turned upward. He looked at the scene for a moment in the doorway. Then he came in, took his coat off, poured a cup, and sat down across from her, and they stayed like that for a long time without needing to explain anything to each other, which was its own kind of language, and by that point possibly the most honest conversation they'd had. The morning after the storm, the ranch looked like something had picked it up and shaken it. 2 sections of the north fence were down, ones they hadn't been able to get to the night before. A section of the barn roof had peeled back at the corner, not catastrophically, but enough that the cold and any future weather would find its way in without correction. The chicken coop Elena had repaired in her first week had held, which she noticed with a satisfaction she didn't announce. The vegetable bed was buried under 2 feet of drifted snow, which didn't matter yet but would need clearing before the ground underneath could start thinking about spring. Elena stood on the porch in the early morning with her coffee and looked at the inventory of damage and felt something that surprised her. Not discouragement, not the weighted, what now feeling she'd expected. Something more like, All right, where do we start? She'd had that feeling before. She'd had it the morning after Thomas's funeral, looking at the paperwork on his desk. She'd had it standing in the empty bedroom after Margaret Holmes' kitchen table conversation. The feeling meant something specific, she'd learned. It meant she'd already decided to stay, and her body was moving ahead of the part of her mind that was still pretending to deliberate. She was staying. She knew that now, in the way you know things that have been true for a while and have finally stopped being deniable. The question of what staying meant exactly was one she wasn't ready to unwrap. Silas came out behind her. He looked at the fence. He looked at the barn roof. He looked at Elena, looking at all of it. "North fence first," she said. "North fence first," he agreed, and went back in for his second cup before they started. The repairs took 4 days. Not because the damage was so extensive, but because the cold that followed the storm was serious in a way that slowed everything. Hands that went clumsy in the first hour, tools that needed warming before they'd cooperate. The particular Wyoming winter math of 3 hours of useful daylight for every problem you were trying to solve. They worked alongside each other in the way they'd established by then. A division of effort that had never been formally negotiated but had settled into something efficient and unspoken, the way working partnerships do when both people are paying attention. Silas handled the structural things, the fence post that needed resetting, the barn roof that required him to go up on it with a pry bar, and Elena's better-than-she'd-admit assistance holding the ladder in wind that still had opinions. Elena handled what needed handling on the ground, the livestock twice daily, the house, the meals that were the only warm, reliable thing in a week of cold, reliable problems. Lila, who had a child's accurate weather sense for the general mood of adults around her, was notably cooperative that week. She stayed where she was put. She played her games without requiring active participation. She appeared at Elena's elbow at regular intervals with offerings, the spoon, a button, once a piece of barn straw she'd found somewhere indoors which raised questions nobody pursued, and then returned to her projects. On the third day, when the barn roof was patched, and the fence was most of the way back, and Elena was in the kitchen making the kind of meal that was mostly about warmth and volume rather than finesse, a pot of beef stew with the last of the fall root vegetables. Silas came in and sat at the table and didn't immediately get up again, which was how she knew something was working through him. She stirred the pot. She waited. "I need to tell you something," he said. Elena kept her eyes on the pot. "All right, the ranch's finances. They're better than they were in October, better than they were in November even." He paused. The way you've been managing the household accounts. The feed costs are down because nothing's being wasted. The egg production is up, which isn't a lot of money, but it's money. The vegetable bed will matter in spring." He was looking at the table. "What I'm trying to say is that you've changed the arithmetic of this place." Elena turned from the stove and looked at him. "That was the job. It was more than the job. Silas, I'm not finished." He said it mildly, but with the firmness of a man who'd started a thing and was going to complete it. "I want to change what I'm paying you, double it." Elena set down the spoon she'd been holding. "That's not... The ranch can support it now. Barely, but it can." He looked at her directly. "I should have been paying you that from the beginning. What you did the first week alone, the co-op and the accounts, and the house. I've been underpaying you because you accepted the number I offered, and I should have pushed it higher from the start." Elena looked at him. "I accepted that number. You accepted what I offered because you were in a position where you didn't have leverage to argue. I knew that and I used it." He didn't look away. "I'm not comfortable with that." She thought about that for a moment. About the kitchen table negotiation in her first week, where she'd named a modest number and he'd gone 20% higher, and she'd been surprised enough to stare at him. She'd thought at the time that was generosity. Now she was looking at a man who was telling her it had been the beginning of what he believed was fair, not the ceiling of it. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. "Because the storm made it clear," he said. "What you did with Pepper, the fence. The month before that, the way you handled the Daniel Mercer situation without falling apart, the way you handled Margaret Holmes in the middle of Dunmore." He looked at his hands. "You're not someone who needs to be paid charity rates. You never were." Elena was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to take more than the ranch can afford." "I told you it can afford it." "Barely," you said. "Barely is still can." He looked at her. "Will you let me do this?" It wasn't quite a question. It was the way he asked things he'd already reasoned through. with the form of a question, but the weight of a position he wasn't going to move from. "Yes," Elena said. "Thank you." He nodded. "Good." He got up to pour more coffee like the conversation was settled, which it was. "Stew smells right," he said, which for Silas Boone was approximately a rave review. What Elena hadn't told Silas, hadn't told anyone, had barely told herself, was that her palm still ached in a way it shouldn't have, 3 weeks after the storm. The rope burn had healed on the surface. The bandage had come off after a week. But there was something deeper in the hand, something she'd done in the fence work or the horse moving or some combination of both, that hadn't resolved the way it should have. She ignored it the way she ignored most things that she couldn't immediately fix, diligently, with the particular discipline of someone who's learned that bodies, like horses, will tell you when they're done being managed, and not a moment before. She should have known better. Thomas had been the same way, and she'd watched where that got him. The morning it actually stopped being ignorable, she was in the barn with Pepper. She'd been spending time there most mornings now. Not formally, not as an assigned task, just as the thing that had gradually become part of her routine. Pepper had become, improbably, the animal Elena felt most at home with on the property. There was something about the horse's specific brand of difficulty, not viciousness, just the principled refusal to trust anything that hadn't earned it, that felt familiar enough to be comfortable. She was brushing Pepper's flank with her right hand, and she reached up with her left to work a tangle in the mane, and the hand seized. Not dramatically, just stopped working. The fingers wouldn't close properly, and what had been a background ache became a foreground one in a way she couldn't will past. She lowered her hand, looked at it, flexed carefully. Silas was at the other end of the barn, and she was aware of him in the way she'd become aware of him in enclosed spaces. Not anxiously, just with the background register of where he was. She turned her body slightly away and kept brushing with her right hand and waited for the left to come back online. It took longer than it should have. "Your hand's bothering you," he said. Not from the other end of the barn. He'd moved, without her hearing it, and was now one stall over. "It's fine." "Elena." She turned around. He was looking at her left hand, which was held in a specific way that was not the way a fine hand is held. "It's been fine," she said, which was not the same sentence. "Has it been fine, or have you been managing it?" She thought about lying, decided against it on the grounds that she'd told him she wouldn't, more or less, that first night. "Managing it," she admitted. "It seized up just now. It'll pass." "How long?" "Since the storm." She watched his face do the calculation. "Don't—" 3 weeks, he said. "It's been improving." "Has it?" She wanted to say yes with more conviction than she actually had. "Mostly," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Doc Reeves comes through Dunmore on Thursdays. Not a full-time office, but he's there from mid-morning on. It's not that serious." "If it's been 3 weeks and it's still seizing up, it's that serious." He said it without drama. "We'll go Thursday. Silas, you went to fight for Lila, against Daniel Mercer." He looked at her steadily. "Is your hand less important than that fight?" "That's different. Only because it's for you instead of her." He went back to what he'd been doing at the other end of the barn, because he'd learned, she'd noticed this about him, that he made his point and then retreated, which was the most effective method for a woman who dug in when she felt cornered. She stood there with Pepper's brush in her right hand and thought about Thomas, who had not gone to the doctor when the cough started because it wasn't that serious. It was improving. It would pass. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he confirmed, from the other end of the barn. Doc Reeves was a man in his 60s who had the face of someone who'd seen most things and found them less alarming than other people did, which was a useful quality in a doctor. He looked at Elena's hand with the impersonal thoroughness of a man for whom hands were interesting, primarily as mechanical objects, asked her 3 questions about when and how and what, pressed on 2 places that told her more than she wanted to know about what was still wrong, and delivered his verdict with a directness she appreciated. Sprained, not broken. Something in the tendons of the palm that had been strained in the rope incident and then used past its tolerance for 3 weeks of ranch work. He told her what she could and couldn't do with it for the next month, gave her a wrap she was to wear at night, and told her to come back if the seizing didn't stop within 2 weeks. "It'll stop," she said. He looked at her over his glasses. "That's the objective," he confirmed. "Not a guarantee." She paid him. She went outside where Silas and Lila were waiting. Lila had been in the wagon with a biscuit and a prohibition on climbing, both of which she appeared to be respecting, and she relayed the verdict. Silas listened, nodded. What can't you do? Anything that puts sustained grip tension on the left hand for at least 2 weeks. No mallet work, no wire work. She said it neutrally, aware of what it meant for the workload. I can still do most things. I'll pick up the wire work, he said. I can help from the other side. I'll pick up the wire work, he said again, not unkindly, with a tone that indicated this was decided and she could use her energy on something else. He picked up the reins. There a bakery in Dunmore? Elena blinked at the change of subject. A small one, I think, on the main street. Lila had the biscuit. He glanced at Lila, who was watching this exchange with academic interest. I thought she might want something from a bakery. Lila, understanding the word bakery with the unerring accuracy of a small person who had decided food vocabulary was a priority, said yes, please, with a clarity that was remarkable, given that she'd largely been conducting her sentences in shorthand up to this point. Silas looked at Elena with the ghost of a smile. I'll take that as a vote. They went to the bakery. Lila selected something iced in a color that didn't occur in nature, ate it with full commitment, and got it on Silas's jacket sleeve in a way that he noticed and said nothing about. Elena bought a small loaf of bread that was better than anything she'd managed to produce herself and made a note about the technique. It was an ordinary afternoon in Dunmore. 3 people in a wagon, a doctor's visit, a bakery. Nothing notable about it from outside. Elena was aware the whole way home of how ordinary it felt, and how recently ordinary had seemed like something that happened to other people. Spring came late to that part of Wyoming and came in arguing with itself, trading warm days for cold ones at no reliable schedule, as though the season hadn't fully committed yet. Elena started working the vegetable bed again in the first real warmth of late March, kneeling in the turned soil and thinking about what to plant and in what order, doing the arithmetic of a growing season, the way she'd once done the arithmetic of $37, with the focused attention of someone who needed it to add up correctly. Lila sat at the edge of the bed and helped, which meant she moved dirt from one place to another with a small spoon and delivered a running commentary on what she was finding in it. Twice she found earthworms and brought them to Elena with the solemn weight of significant discovery. Good, Elena told her each time. That means the soil is healthy. Lila considered this and returned the second worm to the dirt with something that looked like respect. Silas brought coffee out to the garden at some point in the late morning and sat on the fence that bordered the side yard and watched them without making it obvious he was watching. Elena had stopped not noticing this weeks ago. She knew he was there the way she knew where the sun was, not by constantly looking at it, just by the particular way the light fell. What are you planting? He said. Carrots, beets, beans, squash, late-season kale, possibly onions if there's room at the south end. She sat back on her heels and looked at the bed's dimensions. There's room. The squash did well 2 years ago when Clara... He stopped. Elena looked at him. He was looking at the bed. When Clara planted it, he said. It was the first time he'd said her name in connection with a specific memory, rather than just the abstract fact of her. Elena registered that and let it be what it was. What kind? Butternut. She liked butternut. I'll put it at the north end, more sun there in the afternoon. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that was complicated in a way she didn't try to decode. All right, he said. They were quiet for a moment. Lila had moved on from the earthworm project to an investigation of a rock she considered significant. Can I ask you something? Elena said. Yes. Why did you leave the photograph in the book after 3 years? He thought about that. I didn't know where else to put it. He looked at his coffee cup, and I kept thinking, not about her, about who I was when it was taken. We were both younger, and He paused. I was sure about things than I had any right to be. I kept the photograph to remind myself of that, of being sure, of being wrong in a specific way. He looked at her. You have anything like that? Something you keep to remember what you got wrong? Elena thought about it. Thomas's watch, she said. It stopped the night he died, and I never wound it back up. I keep it in my coat pocket. Does it help? It reminds me that time stops when you're not paying attention, she said, literally or otherwise. Silas was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden. I put the photograph away last week, he said, in the chest in the back room. Elena looked at the soil in front of her. She didn't look at him. Did it feel like the right time? Yeah, he said simply. It did. They left that where it was, in the warm spring air with the smell of turned earth and Lila's ongoing geological commentary. And Elena started thinking about seed spacing and the things she wasn't thinking about, both at the same time, which was getting to be a familiar kind of multitasking. The trouble with Ruth Gables came from an unexpected direction. Ruth had become something of a fixture. She came by the ranch every few weeks, ostensibly to return, or borrow something, or consult Silas about shared fence lines, but increasingly just to come by, which Elena understood and appreciated. Ruth was the practical kind of company that didn't require any performance. She drank her coffee and said what she thought and went home. Elena had started looking forward to the visits in the way she'd started looking forward to a few things, quietly and without advertising it. It was on one of these visits in early April that Ruth sat down across from Elena at the kitchen table, while Silas was outside and said, without preamble, "What are your plans?" Elena looked up from the account book she'd been working on. "What plans specifically?" "For here." Ruth wrapped both hands around her cup. "Long term." "I work here," Elena said carefully. Ruth looked at her with the expression of a woman who has no patience for indirection. "Elena." "Ruth." "I'm asking because Margaret Holm has started a new version of the talk," Ruth said. "This one is less about whether you're respectable and more about whether Silas is making poor decisions, sentimental ones, letting a situation develop that isn't organized." Elena set down her pen. "Organized." Her word. Ruth said it neutrally, which meant she'd filtered something sharper. "She's suggesting that Silas is attached and that you're aware of it, and that the situation is one-sided." Elena was quiet for a long moment. What did people say back to her? Most people don't think about it much. Ruth looked at her. But some do. And the thing is, Elena, the talk wouldn't have anything to grab onto if the situation were clear. Clear situations don't generate talk. And you're asking me to clarify it. I'm asking you what you want, Ruth said, which is different. She leaned forward slightly. You're smart, and you're capable, and you've spent 6 months making this ranch into something it wasn't. And Silas is... She paused, choosing. He's a careful man. He doesn't move toward things. He waits to see if they're real. I know, Elena said. Do you know what you want? Ruth said. It was the most direct question anyone had asked her since the first night, when she'd stood on Silas's porch and laid out her situation in plain terms. She'd answered that question clearly because the answer had been clear. A room, work, a place for Lila. Simple. This question wasn't simple. This question had been sitting at the back of everything for months, patient as a creditor, waiting for her to have enough distance from Thomas and enough ground under her feet to answer it honestly. Yes, Elena said. I know what I want. Ruth looked at her. Well? I'm not having this conversation with Margaret Holmes' gossip as the motivation, Elena said. I'm having it because I need to have it. Not for the town, for... She stopped. For me. Ruth sat back. That's fair? She picked up her coffee. I wasn't saying you should do anything because of talk. I was asking because I think you've been not letting yourself look at it directly. Elena thought about that. About the accumulated months of not looking directly at things. The warmth she felt in certain specific moments. The way she tracked his location in a room without consciously deciding to. The night after the storm with his coffee cup across from hers. And Lila sleeping between them. And the knowledge that she didn't want to be anywhere else. I know what I want, she said again. I just don't know if it makes sense to want it. It's too fast. If I'm stopped. If you're using it to replace something, Ruth said quietly. Yes. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Are you? Elena thought about Thomas. The real Thomas, not the grief-softened version. The man who'd eaten biscuits from the outside in and been sure about things, and talked to strangers at auctions, and not rested when he should have. The man she'd loved specifically, with his specific qualities and faults, the way you love people when you actually know them and not just the idea of them. She thought about Silas, who was nothing like Thomas except that both of them were honest, and honesty was the thing she couldn't live without. No, she said. They're not the same. I know they're not the same. Ruth nodded once. Then the question's simpler than you're making it. Elena looked at the account book in front of her, the columns that added up correctly now. The arithmetic of a working ranch, running properly, two people who knew how to do the same things and did them differently enough to complement each other. "I'm scared," she said. Ruth looked at her steadily. "Of course you are. You loved someone and you lost him. Being scared is just what happens next. He might not—" "Elena." Ruth's voice was patient and without condescension. "He put that lamp on for you the second week you were here. I know because I was here and it wasn't on before." Elena didn't say anything. "Talk to him," Ruth said. "Not because of Margaret Holm. Because you should." She didn't talk to him that day. She thought about it all through the evening and the dinner and the pudding. Lila to bed, going over and over what she'd say and how, the way you prepare for something that matters. Every version she tried sounded either too formal or too easy, and the truth was neither. She talked to him 3 days later, and it happened the way things that have been building for a long time happen. Not the way you planned it, but through a side door you hadn't accounted for. They were both in the barn in the early evening, later than usual, because one of the fence posts had needed a second look, and they'd lost track of time. The light in the barn at that hour had a particular quality, the last of it coming through the high window at the west end, the warm breath of the horses in the cooling air. Pepper was eating, which she did with the focused contentment of an animal who'd made her peace with her situation. Elena was putting her tools away. She wasn't planning to say anything. And then she said, "Ruth came by the other day." "I know," Silas said. "I saw her wagon. She wanted to know what my plans were." Elena kept her hands busy with the tools, hanging each one on its peg. "Long term." Silas was quiet. She could feel him being quiet in the specific way of a man who's gone very still. "I told her I knew what I wanted," Elena said. "I just hadn't said it out loud yet. To her. To anyone." She finished with the tools. She turned around and looked at him. "I want to stay here. Not as your employee." She said it plainly, because plain was the only way she knew to say things that mattered. "Not because I don't have anywhere else to go. I know how to build something from nothing. I could do that. Not because of what it would do for Lila, though it would be good for her." She looked at him steadily. "I want to stay because of you, because of who you are and how you are, and the specific—" She stopped, found the right words. "The specific way it feels to be in the same room as you. The specific way I trust you. I don't have better language than that." Silas looked at her. He hadn't moved. His hands were at his sides and his face had the careful quality of a man in whom something had just shifted and who was deciding what to do with the movement. "That's exact language," he said. I know there are things I'm still carrying. Thomas is still—" She stopped. "I loved him. That doesn't disappear. I'm not pretending it does." "I know," Silas said. "I wouldn't want you to. And I know you have things you're still carrying too." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking for something perfect. I'm asking if there's something real." He walked across the barn and stood in front of her, and she could see him working through it. Not whether he wanted to, she thought, but whether he believed he had a right to. That was Silas's particular difficulty, and she'd seen it for months without knowing exactly what it was. The way he kept himself at a specific distance from everything good, as though enjoyment of it required a justification he hadn't finished earning. "Elena," he said. "Yes, I've been trying not to—" He stopped. "You came here with nothing. I didn't want to be a man who—" "You're not," she said. "That's not what this is, and I think you know that." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know that," he said. "I know exactly what this is." His voice was careful with it, the way he was careful with things he meant. "I just needed to hear you say it first." She looked up at him. "Why?" "Because you're the one who's had more taken from you," he said. "If anyone was going to move toward something, it needed to be you. Not me reaching for something you hadn't decided to offer." She thought about that, about the lamp that had been left on in the second week, about the milk heated for Lila on the first night, about the man who'd paid her more than she asked and driven her to the doctor and stood in a blizzard next to her because he'd known she was right, that they couldn't do it alone. "You've been moving toward me for months," she said. "That's different from taking steps," he said. "That's just—" He searched. "Being where you are." She reached out and put her hand on his arm, the right hand, because the left still ached sometimes and would for a while longer. She felt him still further, which was something she wouldn't have thought possible, and then the stillness changed quality, became the stillness of someone who's arrived somewhere instead of waiting. "I'm offering," she said quietly. He put his hand over hers on his arm. His hand was large and rough and warm in a specific way that was entirely particular to him, and she registered that the same way she'd been registering specific things about him for months, not cataloging them, just knowing them, the way you know a place you've decided is yours. All right, he said. It was the same word he used for everything: decisions, agreements, weather, repairs. She'd come to understand that for Silas Boone, all right was not a small phrase. It was the fullest confirmation he had. They stood there for a moment in the barn, with the horses breathing around them and the last light going out of the high window. And it wasn't anything like the grand romantic moment that stories sometimes build to. Her hand ached slightly. He needed a shave. Pepper was still eating with her unhurried contentment. The roof patch from February was visible in the corner, not invisible, never going to be invisible. It was a repair, not a restoration. And there was a difference, and it was fine. Lila found out by accident, the way Lila found out most things, which was by being present and paying attention. It was a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the barn conversation, and they were all three in the kitchen for breakfast, which had become the normal arrangement of the morning. And Silas was pouring coffee, and Elena was at the stove, and Lila was in her chair with her spoon and her button collection arrayed before her, and Silas put a hand briefly on Elena's shoulder as he moved past her to set his cup down. Brief, natural. The gesture of someone who no longer thinks about whether to do it. Lila looked at this. She looked at Elena. She looked at Silas. She looked back at Elena. "He's staying?" she said. Elena turned from the stove and looked at her daughter. 2.5 years old, with her father's eyes and her own specific kind of attention to the world. "He lives here, Lila. This is his house." Lila shook her head, with the gravity of a child correcting an adult who has missed the point. She pointed at Silas. She pointed at Elena. She pointed at the floor. "Staying," she said, with an emphasis that contained a meaning beyond the word's usual scope. Silas crouched down to her level, which he'd been doing for months, meeting her where she was. "Yeah," he said, "we're all staying." Lila looked at him with the evaluating look she'd been deploying since infancy. Then she picked up one of her buttons, a large blue one that had been in a position of prominence in her collection since Elena had given it to her, and handed it to him. He took it. He looked at it. He looked at Lila. "Thank you," he said, like a man receiving something he understood the value of. Lila returned to the remainder of her collection, the transaction complete, and Elena turned back to the stove before the expression on her face did anything she'd have to explain. Spring pulled forward into something that felt like an agreement rather than an argument. The vegetable bed came in, not the butternut squash, which had been ambitious for the season, but the carrots and beets and beans with a thoroughness that satisfied Elena in the way good arithmetic satisfies her, which was to say deeply and without drama. The horses had their full range of the property back. The barn roof held through 3 April storms without comment. Ruth Gables came by and saw how things stood and said nothing about it in the way of someone who had said what needed saying and could now let the rest be what it was. Margaret Holmes' talk shifted in character again. Not gone, but quieter, and directed now less at the arrangement and more at the general topic of Silas Boone's choices, which was terrain she'd always found fertile and which had nothing to do with Elena specifically. Elena let this go with a patience she'd earned through practice. The lamp stayed on in the mornings. The accounts were kept. Pepper trusted Elena completely now and accepted Silas's handling with the slightly less complete trust of a horse that needed to make clear it had preferences. Lila grew 1/2 inch that nobody measured, but Silas noticed, because one morning in late April, he put his hand flat on the top of her head to measure her height against some reference point only he had, and looked at Elena and said, "She's taller." "She was always going to be," Elena said. "Like Thomas?" Elena considered. "Thomas was average height. She's going to be taller than average." She looked at her daughter, who was attempting to teach the large blue button to do something neither of them could follow. "She's going to be a lot of things Thomas wasn't. And some things he was? Probably." She paused. "The talking to strangers at auctions. She'll do that." Silas smiled. The real kind, not the constrained version. It had been appearing with increasing regularity since the barn conversation, like something that had been cleared to come out into the open. "Good," he said. "That's a useful quality." Elena looked at him. "You think so?" "I never had it," he said. It's why I was alone for 3 years. She looked at the window, at the spring light coming across the property that was not hers by any formal arrangement yet, and was hers by every real one. You're not alone now. No, he said. He said it the way he said things that were final and settled and didn't require elaboration. I'm not. Lila finished whatever she'd been attempting with the button and came to stand between them at the window, looking out at the same property with the ownership of a child who has decided something is home and filed the decision permanently. She leaned against Silas's leg with her shoulder the way she'd taken to doing, not asking for anything, just accounting for where he was. He didn't look down, didn't make a thing of it, just shifted his weight slightly to accommodate her, the way you make room for someone who belongs in the space without announcing that you're doing it. Outside, the ranch sat in the afternoon light, the repaired fence and the patched roof and the producing vegetable bed and the healed enough hand and all the rest of the imperfect true things that made it what it was, which was theirs, which was enough, which was real. The formal arrangements came quietly, the way the most important things in that house tended to come. Not announced, not performed, just arrived at through the accumulated weight of what was already true. It was Silas who brought it up, on a Tuesday evening in early May, when the light was staying longer and the air had finally decided it was done, apologizing for winter. They were on the porch after dinner, which had become an occasional habit when the evening was decent enough to sit in. Elena in the chair closest to the door because she could hear Lila from there, Silas on the step with his coffee, both of them doing the nothing that working people do in the few minutes between the day and the dark. He said, "I'd like to talk to Harlow." Elena looked at him. Harlow was the lawyer in Cheyenne, the one who'd written the letter that had ended Daniel Mercer's single attempt to take her daughter. "About what?" she said, though she understood the shape of it. "Making things official." He looked at his coffee cup. "What we are, legally." He paused. "For Lila, partly. So nobody can... So what happened with Daniel can't happen again from a different angle." He paused again. "But not only for Lila." Elena held her cup in both hands. Her left hand had healed properly now. The full movement returned in the last 2 weeks of April, with the reliability that Doc Reeves had promised, but she hadn't entirely believed. She registered that. The healed hand, the evening light, the man on her porch step who was doing what he always did when he asked something that mattered, which was frame it in practical terms because the practical terms were real and he didn't trust decoration. "You're asking me to marry you," she said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing," he said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" He looked at her then. "Asking you to marry me sounds like a thing I've decided. Asking if you'd be willing sounds like a thing we'd decide together." He held her gaze. "I know what I want. I don't want to just tell you what it is." Elena thought about the first night, when she'd stood on this porch and told him she wasn't asking for charity, she was asking for a chance to work. She thought about how carefully he'd listened to that, how he'd been listening to that, and to every version of it she'd said since, in every conversation and every barn and every early morning kitchen. "Yes," she said, "I'd be willing." He exhaled in a way that told her he'd been holding something which she already knew but appreciated the confirmation of. All right, she agreed. They sat on the porch for another half hour in the spring evening and talked about the practical things, when Harlow might be available, whether they'd need to go to Cheyenne or if he'd come through, what the legal name situation would look like for Lila, who was still a Mercer and would stay a Mercer because that was Thomas's name, and she was Thomas's daughter, and Elena was not going to erase that. Silas had not suggested she should. He just nodded when she said it, in the way of a man who'd already thought it through and arrived at the same place. These were the conversations that actually mattered, Elena had come to believe. Not the grand moments. Those were real too, but they were brief. The thing that held was the practical conversation, the one where you found out if two people's sense of what was right lined up well enough to make a life from. Every conversation she and Silas had ever had been that kind of conversation. She thought that was probably why she'd trusted him. Lila's reaction to the information was characteristically her own. Elena told her the next morning, in simple terms, sitting on the kitchen floor at Lila's level, because that was where Lila conducted most of her important business. She said that she and Silas were going to make the family official, which meant they were all going to stay together, not just for now but for good. She used the word forever because Lila was 3 now. Her birthday had been in January, celebrated with a cake Elena had made, and Silas had eaten 2 pieces of without comment, which was his version of enthusiasm. And 3-year-olds understand forever in a way that's both simpler and more complete than adults do. Lila listened to this with the focused gravity she'd inherited from somewhere. Not Thomas, who'd been expressive, not Elena, who was contained, but perhaps from some convergence of both of them, the specific quality of attention that was entirely her own. She looked at Elena for a long moment when Elena finished. Then she got up, walked to where Silas was at the counter, and held up her arms. He picked her up without hesitation. She was getting heavy. She'd grown another half-inch since the April measurement, and she was solid in the way of children who are eating well and sleeping well and using their bodies for the full project of being alive. And he held her the way he'd been holding her for months, with the practiced ease of someone who'd made this particular physical adjustment without noticing when it became natural. Lila looked at his face from close range, in the way she did when she was processing something important, and then she said, "Silas stays." "That's right," he said. She seemed to find this sufficient and indicated she'd like to be put down. He put her down. She went back to the kitchen floor and resumed her current project, which involved a piece of string and a philosophical question about knots that had been occupying her for 3 days. Elena caught Silas's eye over Lila's head. He looked like a man who'd been given something he hadn't worked out how to hold yet, and was figuring it out in real time. She understood the feeling precisely. They wrote to Harlow that week. He wrote back within 10 days, suggesting a date in June, and they made the arrangements with the quiet efficiency of two people who'd been managing practical things together long enough that logistics didn't require extensive discussion. It was Ruth Gables who pointed out, matter-of-factly, over coffee at the kitchen table in mid-May, that there was a county clerk in Dunmore who performed civil marriages, and that traveling to Cheyenne for a ceremony when the legal paperwork could be handled separately seemed like extra work when Elena and Silas both had better things to do. Elena hadn't thought about a ceremony in specific terms. She'd been thinking about the legal structure, the name, the documentation, Lila's security, and had somehow skipped past the ceremony as a thing that required its own planning. "What would you do?" she asked Ruth. Ruth considered it. "Something small," she said. "Here, maybe. Just people who matter." She looked at Elena steadily. "You've never been interested in an audience?" "No." "Then don't make one." Ruth put down her cup. "The paperwork is paperwork. The thing that actually counts is already done." Elena looked at her. "What thing?" "You move toward each other," Ruth said simply. "That was the hard part. The ceremony's just the name you put on it." She thought about that for a long time after Ruth left, about what the hard parts had actually been, not the storm, which had been genuinely hard in the physical sense, but the other kinds of hard. The learning to let someone see her managing rather than managed. The conversation in the barn, saying out loud what she wanted when she hadn't let herself look at it directly for months. The morning she'd told Silas about Thomas's watch and the particular kind of grief that doesn't resolve, only changes shape, and he'd sat with that without trying to fix it. Those had been the hard parts. Ruth was right. They were done. So, the ceremony was small. A Thursday in early June, the county clerk from Dunmore, Ruth and her husband Frank, who spoke little but smiled genuinely, and a man from the neighboring property east of them, Caleb Marsh, a taciturn rancher with whom Silas had a friendship that looked from outside like two people who mostly didn't speak to each other but had been doing it with great loyalty for 15 years. The clerk was a woman named Mrs. Yardley, who'd been performing civil marriages for 22 years and had the brisk warmth of someone who genuinely liked the work without needing it to be momentous. She said the words clearly and waited for the responses and wrote the names in her ledger with the care of someone who understood that what she was writing down mattered. Elena wore the better of her 2 good dresses, which she'd altered in the weeks before because the months of ranch work had changed the shape of her enough that it needed it. Silas wore a jacket that Ruth had apparently told him required pressing, because it was pressed, which was not its default condition. Lila wore her best dress, and her best expression, which was the one that communicated she was prepared to take this seriously, and expected others to do the same. She stood next to Elena and held her hand during the words, and at the moment Mrs. Yardley said it was done, looked up at Elena and then at Silas with a checking expression, making sure the sequence of events matched her understanding of what had been promised. "Still staying?" she said to Silas. "Still staying," he confirmed. She nodded, satisfied, and went to investigate what Ruth's husband Frank had in his jacket pocket, which turned out to be a piece of hard candy he surrendered without complaint. Ruth cried briefly, in the practical way of a woman who allows herself feelings within a specific time budget and then moves on. Frank shook Silas's hand and said, "Good," which was the entirety of his remarks and suited everyone. Caleb Marsh stood near the fence and nodded once at Silas across the yard, which Silas returned with a nod, and Elena understood this was approximately the emotional equivalent of a speech from either of them. She had written to Thomas's grave in her mind that morning. Not a prayer. She didn't do that, hadn't for years. Just a conversation, the way she sometimes had conversations with him still, in the back of her head where he'd taken up a permanent residency that she'd made peace with. She told him she was all right. She told him Lila was more than all right. She told him that she hadn't stopped loving him and that loving someone new didn't require that to be untrue, and that he, of all people, would have understood that because he'd understood most things. She'd thought, you would have liked him. You would have talked at him for an hour, and he would have listened the whole way through. She thought she was probably right about that. The summer was the kind of summer that Wyoming produces maybe every few years, when the weather decides to be generous and the sky cooperates and the land does what land does when it's being properly tended. The vegetable bed came in beyond what Elena had projected. The cattle were healthy. The horses, all three of them, including Pepper, who had settled into a disposition that was still particular but no longer adversarial, had good coats and good weight. Silas had taken on 2 seasonal hands for the summer work, young men from Dunmore who worked hard and needed direction and got it from both Silas and Elena in roughly equal measure, which they'd adapted to with the pragmatism of young men who needed the work. One of them, a 17-year-old named Cody, who was afraid of exactly nothing and good with livestock beyond his age, had attached himself to Elena's working methods with the focused interest of someone recognizing something useful, and she'd found herself teaching him the things she'd taught herself from watching Silas, in the same way Silas had taught her, showing, not explaining, expecting attention. It occurred to her one afternoon, watching Cody manage the roan mare with a competence he hadn't had 2 months earlier, that this was how things lasted. Not by holding on to them, but by passing them through. The specific knowledge, the way of handling, the thing Ruth had called what actually counts, that was less about the formal structure and more about what got learned and carried forward. She'd been thinking about that more since the wedding. About legacy, which was a word she'd always found slightly grandiose, but which kept arriving in her thoughts in more modest, concrete forms. Not statues or namesakes, just what you pass through. What gets carried on. What? The first traveler came in August, on a Friday afternoon when the heat was at its most serious, and the road from Dunmore was the kind of dry that lifted dust with every footfall. Elena saw her first, a woman, older than Elena by maybe 20 years, coming up the road on foot with a bag that had seen better decades. She walked with the particular cadence of someone who'd been walking for a while and had stopped expecting to arrive somewhere. Elena was at the fence when she saw her. She'd been checking the posts on the south line, which was a thing she did on her own now, without needing it to be assigned, and she watched the woman come up the road and recognize something in the gait of it, the weight of it, that she recognized from the inside. She went to the gate. "You need water?" she called. The woman stopped, looked at Elena with the careful expression of someone who'd learned to assess offers quickly. "I wouldn't say no to it." "Come in," Elena said, and opened the gate. The woman's name was Pearl. She was on her way to a sister in Laramie, on foot, because the money for the stage had run out 2 days ago. She hadn't eaten properly since yesterday morning. She said this without complaint, in the way people say things when they've stopped expecting complaint to change anything. Elena brought her inside and put food in front of her and didn't make a production of it, because she remembered what production felt like from the receiving end. She sat across from her while she ate, and they talked about ordinary things, the road, the weather, the sister in Laramie, who sounded like a complicated woman Pearl loved anyway. Silas came in from the east field while Pearl was finishing and looked at the scene with the look that was already becoming familiar to Elena. The quick read of a situation, the rapid and uncomplicated decision. "You're going to Laramie?" he said. "Trying to get there," Pearl said. "Caleb Marsh is taking a load to the rail depot in 2 days," Silas said. "He'll pass close enough. I can ask him." Pearl looked at him. "You don't know me." "I know you need to get to Laramie," he said. "That's enough." He went back outside. Pearl looked at Elena across the table. "He always like that?" Pearl said. Elena thought about the door on the first night. "Come in out of the cold." "Yes," she said. "He is." Pearl slept in the small back room that night. The same room where Elena and Lila had spent their first night on the property, the cot with the wool blanket, the rough floor that was better than outside. In the morning, Elena made biscuits and Pearl ate 3, and looked at Elena over the table with something in her expression that was recognition. "You've been here," Pearl said. "Where I am?" "Yes," Elena said. "Does it—" Pearl stopped. "Does it get past the part where you don't know if you're going to be all right?" Elena looked at the woman across from her, 50 or so, road-worn, tired in a specific way that was more than physical. "It does," she said. "Not all at once, but it does." Pearl was quiet for a moment. "How'd you know to trust it when someone helped you?" Elena thought about that, about Silas's porch and the cold and the 8 doors before it, about the moment she'd made the calculation in the dark and decided to come through the gate anyway. "I wasn't sure I could trust it," she said. "I came in because Lila was cold and I was out of choices. The trust came after." Pearl nodded slowly. "So you just went in?" "I just went in," Elena agreed. Caleb Marsh took Pearl to the rail depot on Sunday morning as arranged, with no commentary and no request for explanation, because Caleb Marsh operated on the same frequency as Silas when it came to practical generosity. He didn't need the story, just the logistics. Elena stood at the gate and watched the wagon go and felt something she'd been feeling with increasing regularity, which was not quite peace. She had too many opinions for peace, but something adjacent to it. The sense of a circle closing, or not closing exactly, but completing a rotation and beginning another, the way things that are working correctly tend to do. Pearl was not the last. She wasn't even the first, technically. There'd been a family with a broken wagon wheel in May, before the wedding, and Silas had spent an afternoon helping fix it without discussion. But Pearl was the one that felt like a beginning of something intentional. And in the months that followed, Elena and Silas both noticed that word got around in the way that word gets around in sparsely populated country, where information travels slowly but reliably, and the Boone Ranch became known in the way that certain places become known. Not from signage or announcement, but from the accumulated testimony of people who'd needed something and found it there. They didn't plan it. That was the thing. There was no conversation where they decided to become a place of refuge. It just emerged from what they already were, the way character always emerges. Not from decision, but from the repeated daily expression of how 2 people were built. A young man on his way west, who'd been robbed on the road and arrived with nothing. A widow, not unlike Elena had been, with 2 children instead of 1 and the same precise kind of exhaustion. An old man who was simply lost, not in the dramatic sense, but in the way of a man who'd outlived his context and wasn't sure what to do next, who stayed 3 days and helped Cody with a fence repair and left steadier than he'd arrived. They didn't take everyone in for extended stays. They couldn't, practically, and Elena had no interest in maintaining a situation that the ranch couldn't support. She kept the accounts too carefully to let sentiment override arithmetic. What they offered was specific: a meal, a night or 2 if needed, information about where to go next, help with whatever the next step actually required, rather than whatever would make the offering feel most generous. She'd learned the difference from being on the receiving end. The most useful help was the kind that got you to the next real thing, not the kind that made the helper feel good about themselves. Silas handled most of the practical logistics without needing direction. Elena handled most of the conversations, because she was better at reading what people needed to say and what they needed to hear, which were not always the same thing. They'd found this division not through discussion, but through the natural settling of what each of them did well, and it worked the way things work when they're honest about their components. Lila turned 4 in January of the 2nd year, and the ranch hands threw her a party that she received with the gracious solemnity of a small person who had decided that parties were appropriate recognition and intended to conduct herself accordingly. Cody, who'd come back for a 2nd season and showed every sign of becoming a permanent feature of the operation, had made her a wooden horse that was not beautiful but was structurally sound, which was Cody's general approach to most things. Lila named it Pepper too, for reasons that were clear to her if to no one else, and it slept in her bed from that night forward. She was talking now in full sentences, with the vocabulary of a child who'd been listening to adult conversations from a very young age and had absorbed the rhythms of them. She asked questions that occasionally stopped people in their tracks, not because they were strange, but because they were exact. The way her attention was exact. The way Elena's was. She had Thomas's eyes and Elena's way of holding them. She had started asking about Thomas, not in a grief-stricken way. She'd been too young when he died for grief in any recognizable adult form, and what she had was more like the shape of an absence she'd never clearly known the presence of. She asked about him the way she asked about everything she was trying to understand, directly, with genuine curiosity, without distress. "Was my papa good at biscuits?" she asked one morning, out of a context Elena couldn't trace. "No," Elena said. "He was good at eating them. Making them was different." Lila considered this. "Was he good at horses?" "He was learning," Elena said. "He wasn't afraid of them. He just hadn't had much time with them." "Did he talk a lot?" Elena smiled. "He talked more than anyone I ever met." Lila absorbed this. "More than me?" "When you get older, maybe the same," Elena said. Lila seemed satisfied with this inheritance. She went back to Pepper 2 and her ongoing curriculum. Silas had listened to this exchange from across the room with the careful attention he brought to conversations that weren't his to join. When Lila left, he said, "You do that well." "What?" "Talk about him with her." He looked at his coffee cup. "Keep him real for her without making it heavy." Elena thought about that. "He was real," she said. "The realest version of someone is the true one, not the preserved one." She paused. "I don't want her to have a father who's a saint. I want her to have a father who ate biscuits from the outside in and talked too much and was learning horses." Silas smiled. "The full version. Outside in is still wrong." "Completely wrong," Elena agreed. "I've told her." He looked at her across the kitchen with the look she'd been looking back at for over a year now. The one that had taken her a while to name, because she'd been out of practice with being looked at that way. She'd named it eventually, not in dramatic terms, but in the plain ones she preferred. It was the look of a man who was exactly where he'd decided to be, and who'd decided with his whole self, and who didn't need to announce it because he was too busy just being it. She thought sometimes about what she'd been carrying that first night on the road. Not the suitcase, the other weight. The specific heaviness of a person who's used up all her options and hasn't yet found the one that was still available. She thought about how close she'd come to turning back from the gate. She thought about Lila saying cold, "Mama in the dark" on that road, and how that one small word had pushed her through a gate she'd almost walked past, the margin. She thought about it often, not with the relief of someone who'd gotten away with something, but with the precise awareness of what thin margins actually mean. They mean one small thing differently, and everything is different. They mean the door that doesn't get knocked on. They mean the woman who stays on the road. She hadn't stayed on the road. She'd come through the gate, not because she was brave, she'd been too tired for bravery, but because Lila was cold and she needed one more door, and this was the last available door, and that was the whole of the decision, and the door had opened. Margaret Holm came to the ranch in March of that second year. She came alone, in her own small wagon, on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was doing the thing it did in early Wyoming spring, where it couldn't decide and cycled through 4 kinds of weather before noon. She pulled up at the gate and sat there for a moment before she got down, which Elena saw from the window. She went to the porch. Margaret Holm was 63 or so, and she looked it in a way she hadn't always, as though something had shifted in the months since Elena had last seen her in Dunmore. She came through the gate with a jar in her hands, preserved peaches, it looked like, and stopped at the porch steps. "Mrs. Boone," she said. Elena had been Elena Mercer Boone since June. She still wasn't entirely used to it, which she figured was normal and wasn't worried about. "Mrs. Holm," she said, "come up." Margaret Holm came up to the porch. She held out the peaches. "I put these up last fall. I have more than I'll use." Elena took the jar. "Thank you. That's kind." There was a silence. Both of them looked at the yard, which had the particular early spring look of a place that had made it through another winter and was getting ready to do something about it. "I heard about the people you've been helping," Margaret Holmes said finally, "through the winter." "It's nothing organized," Elena said. "Just people who need a meal." "Pearl Hutchins is my cousin," Margaret said. "She wrote me from Laramie." Elena looked at her. "I didn't know that." "She told me what happened here." Margaret looked at the jar in Elena's hands rather than at Elena. "She said you sat with her and talked to her and didn't. She said you talked to her like a person." Elena thought about Pearl across the kitchen table, asking if it gets past the part where you don't know if you're going to be all right. "She was easy to talk to," Elena said. "Pearl said you'd say something like that." Something moved in Margaret Holmes' face, something that had been held in a specific position for a long time and had decided to shift. "I was not kind to you," she said. "I talked about you in ways I had no right to." "You did," Elena said, not with heat, just accurately. "I'm sorry for it." She said it the way people say things they mean when they're not used to saying them. A little stiff, a little effortful, but real. "I think I was—" She stopped. "Thomas owed my husband money. I know he paid it back, I know it. But Jim died in between and I was—" She stopped again. "I was angry at things I couldn't be angry at properly, and you were available." Elena thought about what Silas had said that first October, about people being angry at the living for surviving. She thought about how she'd understood it then and understood it more fully now, having been on both sides of grief long enough to know how it distorted things. "I know," she said. Margaret looked at her. "You don't have to forgive me." "I'm not doing it for you," Elena said. "I'm doing it because I can't afford to carry things I don't need." She said it without self-congratulation, just honestly. "You were wrong, and I know it, and now you know it, and we can be done with it." Margaret Holmes stood on the porch with her hands empty, where the jar had been, and looked at Elena with an expression that was something between relief and the particular kind of tired that comes when you've put something down you'd been carrying too long. "The talk will stop," she said. "From me. It already has, mostly." "I know," Elena said. "I noticed." A pause. Then Margaret said with a stiffness that was the last of her guard, "Your husband, Boone. He's a good man." "He is," Elena said. "I always thought so," Margaret said, which was the closest she was going to get to saying she'd been wrong about all of it. And Elena let it be enough because enough was what it was. She offered Margaret coffee. Margaret accepted. They sat at the kitchen table for 45 minutes and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it. The spring planting, the Dunmore dry goods store having changed hands, Pearl's sister in Laramie, who was complicated in the ways Pearl had described. It was the conversation of two women who had decided to be civil and discovered somewhere in the middle of it that they had things in common, which is how most reconciliations actually work, without either party planning it. When Margaret left, she stopped at the gate and looked back at the ranch and Elena on the porch, and she said, "She's going to be something, your girl." "She already is," Elena said. Margaret nodded and got in her wagon and went. What? The summer that Lila turned 5, she learned to ride. Not properly. She was 5, and proper was for later. But she could sit on Rio's back, who was the most agreeable of the horses, and had developed a specific patience for small people that suggested he'd resigned himself to this as a feature of his existence. And she could direct him at a walk with Silas's hand on the lead and Elena walking alongside. And she did so with the expression of a person who has accomplished something significant and intends the world to register it. Cody watched this from the fence with his arms crossed and the look of a young man who had 3 younger sisters back in Dunmore and recognized the expression. "She's going to be asking for her own horse by fall," he said to Elena. "I know," Elena said. "You going to say yes?" Elena watched Lila on Rio's back, sitting straight, one hand on the saddle horn and one hand on the reins the way Silas had shown her face entirely concentrated. "Probably," Elena said. Cody nodded. "I thought so." She thought about that later, about the word probably, and what it meant in a life that had been running on probably for a long time. Probably this will be all right. Probably this is the right door. Probably the ground under this will hold. And how probably had, against all reasonable expectation, added up to something solid. Not certain. She didn't believe in certain the way she'd once believed in it, back before Thomas's cough. Certain was a thing you thought you had until you found out you'd been holding something else. What she believed in now was different, smaller in some ways, larger in others. She believed in the work that was in front of her. She believed in the specific people she could see from where she stood. She believed in going through the gate when you had nothing left to lose and someone inside might heat milk for your daughter and mean it when they said come in. That was the thing, the meaning it. You couldn't plan for it, and you couldn't guarantee it, and you couldn't know it was real until after, when you were on the other side of enough nights and enough storms and enough ordinary mornings to see the shape of it clearly. She'd seen the shape of it clearly. What she had was not the life she'd planned. The life she'd planned had died with Thomas in a house she no longer lived in. What she had instead was the life that had been built from the materials available after that, which were a gate she almost didn't walk through, a man who opened it, a daughter who had never once doubted that the three of them were going to figure it out. Lila completed her circuit of the yard on Rio's back and pulled up near the fence with the specific pride of accomplishment, and she looked down at Elena with Thomas's eyes and said, "Did you see?" "I saw every bit of it," Elena said. Lila considered this adequate and patted Rio's neck with the confidence of a person who has decided an animal is her friend and expects the animal to update its records accordingly. Silas came around the corner of the barn and looked at Lila on Rio and then at Elena, and his face did the thing she'd stopped trying to describe to herself and just let happen. The specific softening of a man who is looking at the things he's decided to be responsible for and finding them, today, intact. "How'd she do?" he said. "Ask her," Elena said. He looked up at Lila. "How'd you do?" Lila looked down at him with the solemnity of someone delivering official results. "Good," she said. "I did good." "You did," he agreed. She nodded, settled, and looked out across the property from her height on Rio's back. The vegetable bed in its second summer abundance, the patched barn roof that had held through everything since, the fence lines that they both knew post by post because they'd walked every one of them, the gate at the road that stood open more than it stood closed these days because that was what they'd decided it was for. Elena stood in the yard of the ranch that wasn't what she'd planned and was better than what she'd planned in the specific ways that mattered, and she thought about the cold road in October, and she thought about Thomas, and she thought about the weight of a 2-year-old on one hip and a suitcase in the other hand, and $37 that wouldn't change the arithmetic no matter how many ways she tried. She thought about what she'd learned, not as lesson, but as lived truth, the kind that comes from surviving something real. That the life on the other side of the worst thing you can imagine is not smaller than the life before it. It's different. It's built from different material, with different hands, and it has different rooms in it. And some of those rooms are ones you never would have found if you hadn't lost everything that was keeping you from the road. She thought about the gate. She thought, "I almost didn't come through." She thought, "But I did." That was the whole of it. That was the part that mattered. Not the courage of it. She hadn't been courageous. She'd been out of options. Not the wisdom of it. She hadn't known anything. She'd just moved in the last available direction. Just the fact of it. Just the going through. The rest had been the work, and the work had been hers, and it had held. Silas stood next to her in the yard, and she felt him there the same way she always felt him. Not looking for him, not checking, just knowing, the background awareness of someone who has become part of the specific gravity of your days. His shoulder was near hers. The evening was coming in long and warm from the west. Lila was talking to Rio about something that required full equine attention. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking," she said. "What about?" She looked at the gate at the end of the drive, standing open in the late afternoon light. "The night I came through that gate," she said, "I almost didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you did." "I know," she said. "So am I." They stood there in the yard of the Boone Ranch and watched the evening come in across the Wyoming hills, and the gate stood open at the end of the drive the way it had been standing for months now. And down the road somewhere there were people who would need it to be open and who didn't know yet that it was, the same way Elena hadn't known. And that was the part that had become the point. Not the arrival but the opening, not the finding but the leaving of the gate unlocked so the next person could find their way through. Lila climbed down from Rio with Silas's help and landed in the dirt with both feet and looked at the world from her height and found it, by all visible evidence, adequate to her requirements. She took Elena's hand on one side and Silas's on the other, and the three of them walked back toward the house in the long summer light. And the house had a lamp in the window that nobody had specifically decided to light, because it had become the kind of thing that simply happened now, the kind of warmth that stops being a gesture and becomes instead just what the place is, what it does, what it's for.